If you've ever complained about a crowded holiday dinner table, spare a thought for Queen Victoria. For her, family meal was less about cozy bonding and more about hosting what looked suspiciously like a logistical exercise in military troop deployment. Meals under Victoria's reign weren't just opportunities to chew food, they were public performances, full-blown productions, and tightly orchestrated spectacles where etiquette and appearances mattered more than appetite. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Now, before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. From the moment Victoria took the throne in 1837, the dining table became an extension of her crown. Eating was a royal duty, and like most royal duties, it required an audience. The Queen almost never dined in solitude. Instead, her meals became theatres of power where guests could witness Her Majesty, not just ruling but chewing with grace. And chew she did, with the eyes of nobles, ambassadors, foreign royalty, and nervous dignitaries fixed on her every move. At Buckingham Palace, dinner could mean over 100 guests seated in glittering rows, surrounded by gilded ceilings, chandeliers dripping with light, and footmen hovering like silent ghosts with trays of silver. Imagine going to a dinner party with 99 other people and realizing you're basically the human version of background noise while the monarch quietly spoons soup at the head of the table. For Victoria, this was normal life. For everyone else, it was a nerve-wracking exercise in posture and fork etiquette. Why so many guests? Because dining was never just eating, it was tactics with porcelain plates. If you were invited to the royal table, it meant you had made it into the Queen's good graces. A seat close to Victoria meant you were important. A seat at the far end of the cavernous table meant you were probably still waiting for her to notice you existed. Conversation wasn't just chatter, it was currency. Nobles angled for seats like modern office workers, elbowing toward the boss's happy hour table. Now, if you're picturing these dinners as jovial, laughter-filled affairs, think again. This wasn't Thanksgiving with Aunt Mildred telling embarrassing stories. Court meals were governed by an ironclad code of etiquette. You didn't just waltz in, plop down, and ask someone to pass the potatoes. Every action was scripted, from when you entered the room to which fork you used. If you forgot the order of your cutlery, congratulations, you had just socially exiled yourself in front of half the aristocracy. And here's where it gets tricky. While these banquets looked dazzling, the pressure to perform was enormous. Every guest was acutely aware that one misplaced napkin or awkward slurp could make them dinner table gossip for months. Foreign ambassadors in particular treated these meals as diplomatic auditions. If you could handle Victoria's dinner table without embarrassing your nation, congratulations, your country might just get a trade deal. The Queen herself didn't exactly help relieve the tension. Victoria was known for her brisk, business-like style of eating. She wasn't interested in lingering over idle chatter. These were not leisurely Mediterranean meals, they were timed performances. She would begin eating, guests would scramble to keep pace, and once she put down her fork, the meal was effectively over, whether you had finished or not. Imagine sitting down to a banquet of 12 courses, only to realize the Queen eats like an Olympic sprinter and you're still on your first bite of fish. For many guests, this meant the experience of dining with Victoria was less about savoring the food and more about surviving the occasion. You weren't there to eat, you were there to be seen eating, politely, silently and quickly. The royal table wasn't a dining room, it was a stage, and you were part of the supporting cast. What made these meals even more overwhelming was their sheer scale. While today we might consider hosting a dozen guests ambitious, Victoria's court regularly seated hundreds during state banquets. The spectacle was jaw-dropping. Miles of polished silverware, forests of crystal glasses, and floral arrangements large enough to conceal a small child. For visiting dignitaries, it was meant to impress, and it did. Nothing said the British Empire is doing just fine, quite like watching 100 people sweat through their etiquette while chandeliers glared down from the ceiling. But beneath the pomp and glitter, these dinners also revealed something telling about Victorian society. Meals were a microcosm of the empire itself, hierarchical, rigid, and constantly on display. Victoria, at the head of the table, symbolized the axis around which the empire turned. The closer you sat to her, the higher your status. The further away, the more you realized you were just lucky to be in the room. Dinner wasn't democratic, it was monarchy on a plate. And yet, despite the formality, there were moments of absurdity. Imagine being so nervous about dropping your spoon that you barely taste the food. Imagine sitting in gilded splendor, hundreds of candles blazing, while secretly wondering if your stomach growling could be heard by the Duke next to you. Imagine attending a banquet so overwhelming in size and etiquette that you left hungrier than when you arrived. So yes, Queen Victoria's meals could feed an army, but they were less about feeding and more about staging. A court dinner wasn't nourishment, it was a spectacle, a message, a performance with gravy. If you were lucky enough to get a seat, you weren't just eating dinner, you were playing a role in the greatest show in the empire. The funny part? For the Queen herself, it was all business as usual. For her guests, it was a high-pressure social gauntlet disguised as supper, and while they tried desperately to balance food, forks, and conversation, Victoria simply sat at the head, perfectly at ease, the one person at the table who didn't have to worry about making a mistake, because after all, who was going to correct the Queen? If you've ever groaned at the sight of yet another dish arriving at a dinner party, Queen Victoria's royal banquets would have finished you off entirely. These weren't meals, they were endurance tests, designed to see how much goose liver, venison, and gelatinous pudding the human body could withstand before crying out for mercy. Victorian royal dinners were notorious for their length, complexity, and sheer abundance, with courses marching in like waves of an invading army. 6 courses were modest, 12 were common. On particularly ambitious evenings, the parade of food felt less like dinner and more like a marathon, where the finish line was dessert wine, if you could make it that far. The evening usually began with soup, which sounds innocent enough until you realize that Victorian soup was not your light modern starter. It came in varieties rich with cream, beef stock, or turtle. Yes, turtle, and was hearty enough to count as a full meal on its own. You'd sip it politely, knowing full well you had another 10 rounds to survive, all while praying you didn't burn your tongue in the process, because nothing says diplomatic disaster like spitting scalding broth across the tablecloth in front of an ambassador. After soup came fish, and not just one fish, but often multiple. Salmon, sole, turbot. The Victorians loved to flaunt their access to Britain's waters. These weren't dainty fillets either. They were full, sauced, and elaborately garnished. The kind of dish that made your knife and fork work overtime. Just when you delicately picked your way through a pile of fish bones without accidentally choking, the footman swept in, plates vanished, and the next course thundered into view. Then came the meat, not just a steak or roast, but an onslaught of flesh, venison saddles, roasted pheasants, mutton, beef, poultry of every feathered persuasion. At this point, vegetarians may wish to excuse themselves entirely, because the Victorian royal table was a carnivore's playground. Every dish was served with rich sauces, gravies, and sides designed to impress rather than refresh. It was less "please enjoy this roast," and more "here is an entire farmyard, and it's your patriotic duty to finish it." Once you were staggering under the weight of fish and meat, the pastries and puddings arrived. Now, when Victorians said pudding, they didn't always mean sweet. Savoury puddings filled with meat or suet often wedged themselves into the middle of the meal, a reminder that in this era, even dessert had trust issues. By the time you reached the actual sweet puddings, you were already half defeated, staring at a wobbling jelly or a towering sponge cake that mocked your shrinking resolve. And just when you thought you could tap out, the Victorians produced cheese. A full cheese course was standard, often served with bread, biscuits, and fruit. Cheese was not a polite closing note. It was a challenge. Congratulations, the course seemed to say. You've survived fish, meat, and pudding. Now prove yourself worthy with a wheel of Stilton. Finally, as if to test your willpower further, came dessert. Fruit, candied nuts, ices and sweet pastries appeared in glittering profusion. To modern sensibilities, fruit might sound like a refreshing reprieve. But remember, this was Victorian fruit shipped from colonies, glazed in sugar and often soaked in alcohol. It was less healthy snack and more sugar-coated empire. Alongside came dessert wines, because what better way to finish an evening of overindulgence than with fortified alcohol strong enough to knock you into next week. Altogether, the sequence of courses wasn't just about food, it was about spectacle and stamina. Each dish proved the wealth, power and reach of the British Empire. Soup wasn't just soup, it was turtle imported from the Caribbean. Fruit wasn't just fruit, it was pineapples shipped from glasshouse hothouses or India. Every plate was a statement, a kind of edible propaganda that told guests, look what we can provide, look how vast our empire stretches, and yes, you will eat it. For the guests, however, the meal quickly turned into an internal negotiation with their own stomachs. Can I make it to the meat course without bursting? Do I really need another slice of pudding? Is that cheese wheel glaring at me? By dessert, no one was truly hungry. They weren't eating anymore. They were negotiating a truce with their digestive systems, and heaven forbid you miscalculated your pace, because once the Queen herself put down her fork, that was the signal. Dinner was over. Imagine sitting there, staring longingly at the untouched pudding in front of you, only to realize that the monarch has decided dessert is finished. Goodbye, custard tart. Hello, eternal regret. It's easy to laugh now, but for the Victorians, these endless courses were deadly serious. They demonstrated not only Victoria's wealth, but also the culinary and organizational power of her court. Feeding 100 guests through 12 courses was no small feat. It required precision, timing, and a kitchen running at the speed of a battlefield supply line. The courses weren't just food, they were a display of control. So yes, when people say Queen Victoria's meals could feed an army, they weren't exaggerating. The royal table didn't just feed, it overwhelmed, it conquered, it marched across your plate with the determination of a regiment, and by the time dessert arrived, you weren't hungry anymore. You were simply grateful to have survived. In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, you'd expect dining with Queen Victoria to be a slow, graceful affair. All silver cutlery, polite conversation and hours of savouring the finest delicacies of the empire. Instead, it often resembled something closer to a royal eating speedrun. Victoria was a notoriously fast eater, known for ploughing through her meals with the efficiency of someone who had a nation to govern and no time to linger over a second helping of soup. This wouldn't have been much of an issue if she were dining alone. After all, everyone has their quirks. Some people chew like they're savouring eternity, others inhale food like a vacuum cleaner. But here's the catch. When you dined with Queen Victoria, you stopped eating when she stopped eating. That was court etiquette, an unbreakable rule. So if you were still on your second bite of salmon and she decided she'd had enough, tough luck, your dinner was over. Imagine the heartbreak, sitting before a banquet table, groaning under the weight of multiple courses, and all you can manage is a spoonful of soup, a nibble of roast beef, and the faint memory of what pudding might have tasted like if only you'd had the chance. For nobles, ambassadors, and unfortunate courtiers, this wasn't dining, it was a race against time. The Queen's fork was your starting pistol, her napkin your finish line. Eyewitnesses at court often remarked on her brisk dining habits. Unlike some monarchs who lingered over elaborate feasts, Victoria treated meals as a means to an end. She would slice, chew, swallow and move on with the momentum of someone checking items off a to-do list. Efficiency was her motto. Dallying over dinner was not. And if you thought you could sneak in one last mouthful after she put her fork down, well, congratulations, you had just committed a breach of royal etiquette. This led to an odd phenomenon. Guests often left royal dinners still hungry. Picture it. You've dressed in your finest clothes, sat in a glittering palace hall, been served some of the finest food in Europe, and yet you return home later that night desperately rummaging for bread and cheese because the Queen decided she'd had quite enough after half an hour. It was like going to a Michelin-starred restaurant and leaving with the appetite of someone who had only been given a complimentary bread roll. Of course, one might ask, why didn't the guests simply eat faster? The problem was etiquette. You couldn't exactly shovel food into your mouth like a starved dock worker while sitting across from royalty. Every bite had to be measured, elegant, and properly paced. So there you were, trying to look refined with delicate forks of venison, while the queen was already blazing through her dessert. By the time you'd finished chewing your third bite, she was setting down her napkin, and the footman was sweeping away your untouched plate with merciless precision. This etiquette nightmare created what might be called the most polite famine in history. Nobles starved not because of a lack of food, but because they were too well-mannered to keep eating. The palace kitchens could produce banquets fit for a regiment, but all of it went to waste if Victoria wasn't in the mood to linger. One can only imagine the heartache of watching a perfectly roasted pheasant vanish from your plate, untasted, simply because the queen had decided her appetite was satisfied. It wasn't only frustrating, it was also politically significant. Foreign dignitaries at these meals had to carefully navigate the pace of royal dining without looking gluttonous or rude. Eating too slowly risked leaving hungry. Eating too quickly risked appearing desperate. Either way, dinner with Victoria was less about enjoying cuisine and more about passing a very high-stakes social exam. Diplomacy sometimes came down not to treaties, but to how gracefully you abandoned your half-finished pudding. And the irony, Queen Victoria herself had a hearty appetite. She wasn't nibbling like a sparrow. Reports suggest she could put away generous portions of meat, puddings, and pastries. She simply did so quickly. So while the queen was perfectly satisfied by the end of her speedy meal, her guests often went home to raid their pantries. One courtier once quipped that dining with Victoria was an exercise in appetite suppression. Not because the food was bad, but because it was whisked away before you could properly eat it. From the perspective of the palace staff, this rhythm must have been maddening. Imagine orchestrating a 12-course banquet with military precision, only to have the whole affair wrapped up in under an hour because Her Majesty didn't feel like lingering. The effort required to prepare such meals was immense, but the Queen's pace turned the event into something more like fine dining on fast forward. So yes, while the Victorians didn't have McDonald's or drive-thrus, Queen Victoria invented her own version of fast food, a dining experience so swift that guests barely tasted the meal before it was over. The grand irony of her reign is that meals capable of feeding an army often left courtiers sneaking off for a midnight snack. To dine with Queen Victoria was to enter a culinary paradox, surrounded by abundance, yet left unsatisfied. The palace table promised luxury, but etiquette demanded restraint, and in the end, everyone's appetite hinged on one woman's fork. It was fine dining, yes, but in practice, it was royal fast food. For most of us, breakfast is a modest affair, maybe a piece of toast, a boiled egg, or on a reckless day, pancakes drowning in syrup. But for Queen Victoria, breakfast was not the most important meal of the day. It was practically a military campaign. Forget cereal, forget porridge. Her morning spread was enough to make a small farming village rethink its livestock numbers. A typical royal breakfast during her reign included eggs, cold meats, fish, sausages, toast, butter, marmalades, and multiple kinds of jam, all washed down with endless cups of tea and coffee. Some days included kedgeree, a rice and fish dish beloved by Victorians, or game pies left over from the previous night's feast. For the Queen, this wasn't gluttony. This was simply breakfast as usual. Her version of a light meal could have easily powered an entire regiment of soldiers for a day of marching, and she wasn't dining in some cozy kitchen nook either. Breakfast for Queen Victoria was often served in full formal style. Picture silver trays, footmen attending, and platters laid out like a buffet large enough to make even modern hotels blush, where we might grab a granola bar on the go. Victoria sat down to a multi-course morning ritual that made continental breakfast look like a famine. The Victorians took breakfast seriously, and none more so than their queen. This wasn't just about satisfying hunger. Breakfast was a statement, a reminder of abundance, prosperity, and empire. Every dish told a story. The fish might have been freshly caught from Britain's rivers. The marmalades were flavored with oranges imported from the Mediterranean. The coffee beans came from Ceylon or the Caribbean. Every slice of toast was a reminder that Britain's reach was global, and the Queen could start her day by consuming half of it before 9 a.m. The sheer variety on her table also reflected a peculiarity of the age, the Victorian obsession with choice. If you were wealthy, you didn't just eat. You curated a spread so vast that it forced the eater into a decision-making crisis. Do you start with the cold ham or the smoked haddock? Do you butter the toast or smother it in jam? By the time you've made up your mind, the Queen has probably already finished and left, and you're staring at your plate in existential despair. And make no mistake, Victoria could put food away. Accounts from her household note that she had a robust appetite, especially in the mornings. While she often ate quickly at formal dinners, her breakfast habits showed no sign of daintiness. Eggs, bacon, sausages, she ate heartily and without apology. Breakfast wasn't a warm-up for the day. It was the first act of an ongoing feast. The contrast to the average Victorian subject is of course glaring. For the working poor in the factories and slums, breakfast might be a single hunk of bread dipped in weak tea if they were lucky. Many went without entirely, beginning back-breaking work on empty stomachs. Meanwhile, the Queen was deciding whether to have the trout before or after the sausages. It's one of history's great ironies. The meal that was supposed to set you up for the day set up Victoria to govern, while it set up her subjects to faint on factory floors. The scale of her breakfast also points to another truth. The Victorians saw meals not just as nutrition, but as entertainment. A lavish breakfast gave the Queen a chance to gather with family, discuss the day's events, and sometimes even receive courtiers. In fact, breakfast at Osborne House, her seaside retreat, was practically legendary. The spread there could rival dinner in size, with added seaside delicacies. Imagine rolling out of bed, glancing at the ocean, and then being confronted with a table that looked like Poseidon's buffet combined with a butcher's shop. And the best part, this was only the start of her day. After consuming a breakfast fit for a small army, she would go on to have lunch, tea, and dinner, each of which was a production in itself. Breakfast wasn't meant to tide her over until evening. It was meant to power her until, well, lunch, which could sometimes look suspiciously like dinner's younger sibling. One has to wonder how her staff managed all this. Breakfast wasn't just food, it was an operation. Footmen laid out the table, cooks rose early to prepare hot dishes, coffee and tea were brewed in massive quantities, bakers delivered fresh bread rolls. By the time Victoria actually sat down, dozens of people had already worked themselves into exhaustion to make sure her light snack appeared effortless. And yet, despite all this grandeur, breakfast also revealed a surprisingly human side of Victoria. She wasn't munching away in silence. She enjoyed her morning meals as a chance to gather with Albert and her children, at least before Albert's death. They laughed, talked, and planned their days. In a way, breakfast was the closest she came to normal family life, except of course your normal family probably doesn't require 5 servants just to refill the jam jars. So while you sip your coffee tomorrow morning and nibble on a slice of toast, remember, for Queen Victoria, that would barely count as a garnish. Her morning appetite could stock a village, her breakfast table could double as a banquet hall, and her light meal could fuel an entire regiment of soldiers, probably with leftovers to spare. In the Victorian world, breakfast was more than food, it was theatre, and in Victoria's case, it was the opening act of a day-long performance where the empire itself was served, one sausage at a time. If there is one thing you should never do at Queen Victoria's dinner table, it's ask for a salad. Not because they didn't exist, they did, but because doing so might earn you a look of royal confusion, as if you'd just asked for a glass of unicorn milk. For the Victorians, and especially for their monarch, meals were powered not by leafy greens, but by what could be hunted, roasted, or carved from a creature that once walked, swam, or flew. The Victorian upper classes were, quite simply, obsessed with meat. To eat meat was to eat status. If your plate featured roast beef, venison, mutton, pheasant, or hare, you weren't just eating dinner. You were declaring to the world, yes, I can afford servants, land, and enough hunting dogs to populate a small petting zoo. Vegetables, meanwhile, were given the culinary role of background extras. A carrot might make it onto the plate, but only to brighten the scenery, not to be taken seriously as nourishment. Queen Victoria herself was no exception. In fact, she was leading the carnivore charge. One of her most adored dishes was roast beef, thick, juicy, and often presented with horseradish. Venison was another favourite, and since the royal estates had no shortage of deer, it was always within reach. According to accounts from her kitchens, the queen could easily be served venison twice in the same day, once at lunch and again at dinner. For her, it wasn't a matter of indulgence but of routine. A life without red meat was as unimaginable as Buckingham Palace without corgis. And let's not forget the sheer variety of meats on offer. Royals and their guests weren't just eating the usual beef or chicken. They feasted on game from royal hunts, rabbits, pheasants, grouse and partridge. When a royal hunt was successful, the kitchen became a battlefield of roasting, braising and stewing, with the spoils transformed into multi-course feasts. Imagine sitting down to dinner knowing that what you're eating might have been shot by the prince consort himself earlier that week. It gave farm-to-table dining a distinctly aristocratic twist, forest to fork. To modern ears, the sheer volume of meat sounds overwhelming, but for Victorians it was proof of health, power and tradition. The era was still shaped by a belief that meat gave strength. The muscle of animals was thought to pass its vigor onto humans. So if you wanted to be strong, you didn't load up on kale, you loaded up on mutton. This explains why a typical upper-class dinner menu might contain multiple meat courses back-to-back, each heavier than the last. It wasn't about balance, it was about bravado. Of course, this raises the question, what about the vegetables? Well, they were there, technically. Potatoes, turnips and peas occasionally joined the banquet, but only as accessories. They weren't treated with the respect they enjoy today. Instead, they were often overboiled, under-seasoned, and left to sulk on the side of the plate. In a royal dining context, a pea wasn't meant to satisfy hunger, it was there to provide contrast. Think of it as edible garnish rather than actual food. Asking for more vegetables would have been like asking the orchestra to turn up the triangle during a symphony. The Queen's appetite for meat also set trends for the nation. As the monarch, her preferences influenced upper-class habits and even trickled down into middle-class aspirations. If Victoria loved roast beef, then roast beef became a dish of national pride. It wasn't just dinner, it was a statement of British identity. In fact, Britons were so associated with beef consumption that the French nickname for English soldiers was les roast-beefs, the roast beefs. You can imagine how proudly Victorians wore that badge, even if it made them sound like walking Sunday dinners. Meanwhile, the kitchens of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle became meat-producing machines. The staff had to keep up with not only the Queen's preferences, but also the demands of the endless state banquets, luncheons and suppers. This meant whole sides of beef, racks of venison and game birds were constantly being prepared. The palace larders were less like kitchens and more like medieval butcher shops on overdrive. Servants became experts at carving, roasting and presenting meat dishes with just enough flair to impress hundreds of well-fed nobles. But while Victoria relished meat, she wasn't entirely reckless about it. Reports suggest that she avoided overly rich or exotic preparations. She preferred straightforward roasts to elaborate French concoctions. While her chefs often trained in French cuisine, they had to adapt to her more conservative tastes. This meant less fiddly sauces and more hearty roasts. In a way, her preference for plain meat dishes reflected her personality, practical, no-nonsense, and rooted in tradition. So, if you picture the royal table during Queen Victoria's reign, imagine an endless parade of roasts, game pies, venison haunches, and perhaps a single lonely carrot trying to be noticed. The meat dominated every course, the centerpiece of both sustenance and symbolism. And while her reign oversaw revolutions in industry, empire and technology, her plate remained steadfastly loyal to one truth. Nothing said power quite like a slab of beef. The joke, of course, is that in the Victorian royal household, vegetables were treated like optional extras. If meat was the rock star of the meal, vegetables were the opening act nobody remembered. Queen Victoria's meals didn't just feed an army, they were an army, marching into the stomach with roast beef leading the charge, venison flanking both sides, and the occasional turnip waving timidly from the rear. If you've ever been caught sneaking a biscuit from the tin when you swore you were cutting back, take comfort. Queen Victoria, ruler of the largest empire on earth, was doing the exact same thing, except her biscuit tin was basically a national bakery. While her meals were legendary in size, her devotion to sweets deserves its own crown. Victoria didn't just like dessert, she weaponized it. For starters, the Victorians as a whole were entering what historians might call the golden age of pudding. Industrialization had made sugar more accessible, though still expensive for the poor, and suddenly the upper classes were gorging on trifles, sponges, custards, and pies. And in the middle of this sugar storm stood Queen Victoria, a monarch who could turn a casual tea into what looked suspiciously like a wedding reception buffet. Her sweet obsession can be seen most clearly in her official favorite, the Victoria sponge cake. It's not often you get a dessert literally named after you, and even rarer when it becomes so iconic that it outlives your empire. Imagine being so influential that the legacy of your 64-year reign boils down to 2 layers of fluffy sponge with jam in between. The Victoria sponge was simple compared to other royal confections, but that was the genius, light, airy, and frankly far more dignified than trying to gnaw through a block of medieval fruitcake that could double as construction material. But the sponge was just the opening act. The royal dessert tables looked like Willy Wonka had been given an unlimited budget. Chocolate sponges, custard creams, delicate ices, molded jellies that wobbled like nervous courtiers, and fruit tarts graced her tables regularly. Jellies in particular became a Victorian obsession, partly because they were difficult to make before refrigeration. Having a jelly centerpiece was like saying, "Yes, I have the money to keep calves' feet boiling for hours to make gelatin." What of it? Queen Victoria adored them, and guests could find an entire parade of quivering molds brought out in rainbow hues. Chocolate, too, was entering its Victorian prime. Thanks to advancements in processing cocoa, what had once been a bitter luxury was becoming sweeter and more versatile. Victoria is said to have enjoyed chocolate sponges, chocolate creams, and the occasional cup of hot chocolate. In an era when cocoa was advertised as both a health drink and a luxurious indulgence, she embraced both ideas with gusto. Chocolate wasn't just for dessert, it was practically medicinal. Take that, kale. And then there was the pudding empire. Victorians didn't just stop at one pudding per meal. You could have cabinet puddings, bread and butter puddings, suet puddings, treacle puddings. To the modern ear, it sounds like a crime scene involving flour and raisins. But to the Victorians, each pudding was a little victory against the cruel vegetable-ridden world. Queen Victoria adored her puddings, and royal kitchens turned them out with military precision. Of course, sweets weren't confined to banquets. Afternoon tea, a Victorian innovation popularized by her friend the Duchess of Bedford, became another outlet for Victoria's sugar cravings. Tea was never just tea. It was sandwiches, cakes, and enough pastries to induce a strategic nap. For Victoria, this ritual became a social anchor, offering her comfort and continuity throughout her reign. Imagine running an empire in the morning, and then sitting down in the afternoon to debate the merits of sponge versus tart. It's multitasking at its finest. What makes Victoria's sweet tooth even more fascinating is how it reflected her personality. She wasn't an extravagant monarch in every sense. She was actually considered frugal in certain areas of personal spending. But when it came to desserts, restraint simply wasn't on the menu. This contrast made her sugar indulgence stand out all the more. It was as though she allowed herself to be queenly and indulgent only through the medium of pudding. Naturally, jokes abounded about her love for sweets. One might imagine her courtiers developing a sixth sense for when chocolate sponges would appear, lingering after meals with the desperate hope of snagging leftovers. Guests at banquets faced not just the royal etiquette of eating quickly, as covered earlier, but the royal challenge of pacing themselves to survive until pudding. The danger wasn't just overeating, it was failing to keep up with the Queen's pace and missing out on dessert entirely. To be cut off before the sponge arrived was a fate worse than diplomatic exile. There's also something deeply relatable about Victoria's devotion to sweets. Here was the most powerful woman in the world, commanding armies and ruling over continents, yet she still got excited over jam-filled sponge cake. Strip away the palaces and pageantry, and she's all of us staring into the fridge at midnight, negotiating whether a slice of cake counts as breakfast if you eat it fast enough. By the end of her reign, Queen Victoria had become inextricably linked with the image of indulgent yet comforting food, and her sweet legacy lives on in every supermarket bakery aisle. Next time you see a Victoria sponge on a plate, remember, it's not just cake, it's imperial history disguised in sugar and flour. So yes, Queen Victoria's meals could feed an army, but her desserts alone, they could launch a national sugar shortage. If you think modern political dinners are stressful, name cards, speeches, and too much sparkling water, try organizing a Victorian state banquet. When Queen Victoria dined with foreign dignitaries, she wasn't just offering roast beef and pudding, she was serving up a side of politics. These banquets were carefully orchestrated performances, where food, ceremony, and diplomacy all sat down at the same table, even if they didn't always get along. For starters, the guest list was its own battlefield. Who sat closest to the Queen? Who got the better wine? Who had to sit 3 chairs down next to the cousin no one liked? The Victorians believed placement at the table was practically a geopolitical statement. Putting a French ambassador at the far end was basically saying, "We'd love to talk trade deals, but please enjoy your soup from across the room." Every seating chart was an exercise in both hospitality and strategy, with each name card a tiny chess move in the great game of empire. And then came the performance of the meal itself. These banquets were no small affairs. They often included hundreds of guests, multiple courses, and an army of servants working in synchronized silence. The Great Hall of Buckingham Palace would be transformed into a glittering display of Victorian might. Towering candelabras, mountains of flowers, endless silverware polished to a shine you could spot your diplomatic reflection in. For visiting monarchs or ministers, it wasn't just dinner, it was Britain showing off. "Look at our empire," the meal said. "We have enough silver to blind you and enough food to feed a regiment." Menus themselves were crafted with political subtlety. If the Tsar of Russia was in attendance, you might see dishes with a Slavic flourish. Hosting the French, then it was time for the finest sauces, soufflés, and a touch of culinary flattery. Food was used as a peace offering, a way to soften rivalries with a well-cooked venison roast. After all, it's hard to argue about colonial borders when you're elbow-deep in custard tarts and claret. But behind the grandeur, there was the constant problem of timing. State dinners were choreographed like operas. Every dish had to be served at the exact moment. Every wine poured in the correct order, every crumb of bread aligned with royal standards. Servants rehearsed these evenings like military drills, ensuring that 300 plates of roast lamb hit the table simultaneously, piping hot and arranged identically. To put it bluntly, Michelin-starred restaurants have nothing on a Victorian state banquet. Gordon Ramsay may shout, but Queen Victoria's staff knew that messing up a soufflé in front of a visiting king could be the culinary equivalent of declaring war. Then there was Victoria herself. As the centerpiece of the evening, she didn't just preside over the table, she embodied the empire. Every bite she took was watched. Every glance she gave signaled approval or disdain. Foreign guests weren't just dining with a queen, they were measuring the health of Britain's monarchy with every spoonful of consommé. And though she often ate quickly in private settings, at these dinners Victoria kept to the script, deliberate, regal, and always just enough to suggest that Britain's appetite for food and power was steady and strong. Diplomacy over the dining table wasn't always smooth, of course. There were cultural clashes, misunderstandings, and occasional disasters. Imagine offering a German dignitary a traditional English pudding and realizing halfway through that he's politely choking it down out of sheer diplomatic duty. Or the French ambassador politely smiling at a perfectly roasted English joint of beef while silently cursing that it wasn't bathed in enough sauce. These banquets required not just good chefs but also good actors, guests who could pretend that yes, they loved eel pie, and yes, the wine pairing was inspired, and while treaties were rarely signed at the dinner table itself, the groundwork for alliances often started there. Sharing a meal broke down barriers in a way that formal speeches couldn't. You might distrust another monarch's navy, but if you'd both laughed over a wobbly jelly that refused to come out of its mold, well, suddenly Britain's empire didn't seem quite so intimidating. Food had a way of making politics human, even if only for the length of a dinner. The real genius of these state banquets wasn't just in the flavor, it was in the spectacle. They were a soft power tool, a way for Britain to remind guests that the empire wasn't just powerful militarily, but culturally, socially, and culinarily. After all, if you can host 300 people with precision and still have enough pudding left over for seconds, what can't you do? And perhaps the best part, while guests were maneuvering through the etiquette of forks, knives, and diplomatic small talk, the servants, those unseen stagehands of history, were the ones truly holding the evening together. Without them, the whole production would collapse faster than an undercooked soufflé. So the next time you attend a dinner party and feel nervous about the seating arrangements or whether your casserole will impress, just remember, at least you're not hosting an empire's worth of politics alongside the potatoes. Queen Victoria's banquets remind us that sometimes the fate of nations doesn't rest in the hands of generals or kings, but in whether the custard tart makes it to the table without collapsing. Behind every one of Queen Victoria's elegant meals, whether it was a stately breakfast of eggs and haddock, or a banquet spread that looked like the entire produce of Britain had been assembled in one room, wasn't just a kitchen, it was an army. And unlike most armies, this one didn't march into battle with muskets or sabers. No, this army carried ladles, carving knives, serving trays, and an almost superhuman ability to bow on command without dropping the gravy boat. Dining with Victoria wasn't just about the food, it was about the flawless machine of labor that made it possible. A royal meal was essentially the culinary equivalent of a military operation, except with fewer bayonets and more soufflé. At the top of this culinary hierarchy were the royal chefs, often imported from France because, let's face it, nothing says prestige like a Frenchman with a ladle. These weren't your neighborhood cooks making stew on a wood fire. They were master strategists of sauces, commanders of consommé. They planned menus weeks in advance, balanced dishes for flavor, and managed dozens of assistants who scurried around chopping, whisking, and trying not to be yelled at. For them, cooking wasn't just a job, it was theater. They had to consider not only how a dish tasted, but how it looked on the plate, how it was carried into the dining hall, and how quickly it could be eaten before the Queen moved on to the next course, a serious hazard for anything that required more than 3 bites. If the chefs were the generals, the footmen were the infantry, those gleaming men in livery who glided silently around the dining room with platters balanced as if gravity had decided to take the night off. Their role was deceptively simple: carry, serve, and clear. But the precision involved was staggering. Footmen had to know exactly when to step forward, when to retreat, and how to do it without colliding with each other like clumsy dancers in a particularly stressful waltz. Add to that the requirement of absolute silence, and you start to appreciate their skill. Imagine tiptoeing around with a platter of venison while trying not to sneeze in a hall filled with 200 candles and twice as many perfumes. That's a level of restraint most of us couldn't achieve in a yoga class. And they didn't just serve food, they were part of the spectacle. Their uniforms, their posture, their synchronized movements all reinforced the idea that dining with the Queen wasn't just eating, it was ceremony. No royal dining system would be complete without the butlers, those masters of wine cellars and guardians of etiquette. They weren't just pouring claret, they were curating the very mood of the evening. Serving the wrong wine with the wrong dish could be a diplomatic disaster. especially if you had a French ambassador at the table who was already side-eyeing the roast beef with suspicion. Butlers also managed the hierarchy among the servants themselves. They ensured that plates arrived hot, that no guest's glass remained tragically empty, and that the Queen's table maintained its aura of perfection. In modern terms, think of them as event managers with better waistcoats. Behind the glamour of the dining hall was the true battlefield, the kitchens. These were massive spaces, often hot enough to cook a man without the oven's help. Filled with clattering pans, roaring fires, and frantic activity, the lower-ranked cooks and scullery maids bore the brunt of it, peeling mountains of potatoes, scrubbing endless stacks of pans, and preparing enough gravy to fill the Thames. For them, royal dining wasn't elegant, it was exhausting. Every dish had to be perfect, every plate spotless, and every mistake invisible. Drop a roast chicken in your own kitchen and you laugh it off. Drop one in the royal kitchen, and it might feel like you just committed treason. It wasn't just cooking and serving. It was logistics on a grand scale. Supplies had to be ordered and delivered daily. Meat, fish, fruits and vegetables had to arrive fresh, which often meant coordinating with farms, fisheries and markets that supplied the royal household. When a state banquet was planned, it was like feeding an entire village, except the villagers were dukes and duchesses with very particular tastes. Add to this the table settings, hundreds of pieces of fine silver polished until they gleamed, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers on parade, and napkins folded into shapes that would put modern origami to shame. It wasn't just dinner, it was a logistical masterpiece. The irony, of course, is that this entire operation, dozens of chefs, footmen, butlers and scullery workers, was ultimately at the mercy of one woman's appetite. If Queen Victoria decided she was done eating, the meal was over. Imagine being one of those cooks who spent hours perfecting a dish only for it to be cleared away untouched because Her Majesty had moved on to pudding. That's not just disappointing, that's the culinary equivalent of writing a novel and having the publisher use it as a doorstop. So when we think of Queen Victoria's dining habits, it's easy to picture her lifting a fork daintily or slicing into roast beef with regal precision. But the real story is behind the curtain. An entire army of workers, sweating, balancing, bowing and orchestrating a performance that made every meal appear effortless. Her meals didn't just feed an army, they required one. When most people think of a picnic, they imagine a blanket, maybe some sandwiches, perhaps a basket with apples rolling around, and if you're unlucky, ants staging a full-scale invasion. For Queen Victoria, however, a picnic was not so much an afternoon snack outdoors as it was the relocation of Buckingham Palace's dining room into a meadow. Forget red and white gingham cloth, we're talking silver platters, crystal goblets, and a spread of food that could intimidate a modern wedding reception. Victoria adored the outdoors, particularly the Scottish Highlands, where she and Prince Albert retreated for a sense of pastoral simplicity. Of course, simplicity in this context meant servants hauling dozens of dishes up hillsides so the Queen could enjoy rustic charm without ever being inconvenienced by actual rusticity. A Highland picnic for the Queen wasn't a matter of cheese and bread. It was roast beef, pies, fish, puddings, pastries, and probably a full tea service thrown in for good measure. In essence, it was less a picnic and more a field deployment of the royal kitchen. The logistics were astounding. Servants packed enormous hampers that contained not only the food but also the full dining accoutrements: silver cutlery, porcelain plates, candlesticks, and sometimes even small tables. Imagine being a footman assigned to carry porcelain teacups across muddy fields and not break a single one. That's pressure. Some accounts even mention entire cooking operations being set up outdoors, with portable ovens or spits for roasting meat, just in case Her Majesty suddenly felt like mutton while enjoying the fresh air. Victoria's love of picnics wasn't just about indulgence, though. It had political and personal undertones. By hosting elaborate outdoor meals, she projected an image of accessibility, a queen who loved the land and the simpler joys of life. Except, of course, her version of simple joys came with a staff-to-guest ratio that would make a Michelin-starred restaurant blush. These events were often attended by members of the court, visiting dignitaries, and foreign royals, turning a meadow lunch into a stage for diplomacy. A picnic basket became a weapon in the arsenal of soft power, proving once again that Victoria understood the politics of food. But let's not forget, the Queen also had a hearty appetite. She wasn't just nibbling on cucumber sandwiches while looking at the heather. Diaries and letters record her enjoying hearty slices of roast beef and pastries during these outdoor feasts, often washing it down with wine or tea. If anything, the picnic allowed her to eat with less rigid ceremony than the banquets at Windsor or Buckingham, where every bite was scrutinized by court etiquette. In the fresh air of Balmoral, she could be more herself, albeit still with 10 footmen standing by. And then there were the appearances in paintings and illustrations. Victorian artists loved to depict the Queen's family as wholesome, outdoorsy, and almost middle class in their affections. These images often show Victoria and Albert surrounded by their children, seated on blankets, enjoying a meal that looked like something your neighbour might pack for a day at the park. What the paintings conveniently left out were the 30 servants just outside the frame, balancing platters of game pies and champagne bottles. The Victorian spin doctors understood that nothing sold the monarchy better than the illusion of modesty, even if the Queen's modesty required its own transport wagon. Of course, to the casual observer, a royal picnic could look chaotic. Servants scurried back and forth delivering courses, tables were laid with military precision, and all of it was subject to the unpredictable forces of British weather. Imagine carrying out a custard tart on fine china, only for a gust of Highland wind to try to send it airborne. Yet despite these hazards, the picnics became a beloved part of the royal routine, a way for Victoria to merge her appetite for grandeur with her longing for the countryside. From a modern perspective, one can't help but laugh. A picnic is supposed to be casual, even lazy, a way to avoid the complications of the kitchen. For Queen Victoria, it was the opposite, a logistical ballet requiring planning, manpower, and enough food to feed a regiment. Her idea of packing light meant reducing the cheese course from 4 options to 3. The irony is delicious. In her quest to enjoy the simplicity of nature, she brought the entirety of her palace with her, just on portable terms. The good news? Everyone got fed, usually quite well. The bad news? If you were a servant, picnic duty was a test of stamina, balance, and absolute terror of dropping the royal teapot. So the next time you head to the park with a sandwich and a soda, remember that Queen Victoria would have considered your picnic shockingly minimalist, practically starvation level. Her definition of eating outdoors was less about communing with nature and more about proving that grandeur could follow her anywhere, even into the middle of a Scottish field. If you were a guest at Windsor Castle, you might have left dinner groaning under the weight of 12 courses, a roast swan, and enough pudding to double as ship ballast. But if you were a factory worker in Manchester, your banquet might consist of a heel of bread, some weak tea, and the vague hope that someone dropped a potato in the street. Victorian Britain was a land of staggering contrasts, where the Queen dined like an empress while her subjects often dined like Oliver Twist, except without the possibility of asking for more. To understand just how wide this culinary chasm stretched, let's start at the royal table. Queen Victoria could command venison from Balmoral, fresh fruit from the royal hothouses, and delicacies imported from across the empire. Sugar, once a luxury, flowed freely in her desserts thanks to plantations in the Caribbean. Tea was shipped in by the ton from India and Ceylon, and spices came courtesy of Britain's global reach. The Queen never had to worry about a bad harvest or spoiled meat. Her kitchens had staff to ensure everything was fresh, beautifully presented, and well within her personal preferences. Meanwhile, in the crowded industrial cities, the reality was bleaker. Poor families lived on bread, margarine, weak tea, and the occasional scrap of bacon. Fresh fruit and vegetables were scarce luxuries, and meat was often unattainable except for a Sunday joint if you were lucky. Many working-class diets leaned heavily on potatoes, porridge, and watery stews, with nutrition levels so low that scurvy and rickets weren't exotic diseases but everyday realities. Imagine explaining to a hungry mill worker that Her Majesty had just turned down a second helping of roast beef because she didn't fancy it. you might not survive the conversation. This divide wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Social reformers like Henry Mayhew documented the lives of the urban poor, exposing the grim reality of people who sold flowers, swept chimneys, or labored 12-hour shifts just to afford bread. Charles Dickens turned the disparities into biting satire, with scenes of lavish banquets set against starving orphans. And while Victoria herself wasn't indifferent, she was known to support charities and show concern for her poor. The reality remained that one section of society dined on silver platters, while another licked crumbs off wooden ones. There's also an irony in the timing. The Victorian age coincided with the growth of industrial agriculture, food imports, and the mass production of staples like flour and sugar. Britain was feeding the world with its empire, yet many of its own citizens went hungry. The Queen's feasts became symbols of imperial prosperity, but they also highlighted the grotesque inequality of the era. If a royal banquet represented Britain's wealth, the slums of London represented its cost. Now, to be fair, the Queen wasn't personally responsible for every empty stomach, but the sheer spectacle of royal dining, 6 to 12 courses, endless wines, sugar sculptures taller than children, stood in stark contrast to the daily grind of working families. Imagine knowing that your sovereign's picnic included roast meats, custards, and champagne, while your own dinner might be little more than boiled cabbage water. The real tragedy is how normalized it all was. Aristocrats and gentry thought nothing of dining on dozens of dishes while the poor starved outside the palace gates. Etiquette manuals devoted chapters to how one should properly carve a swan or politely refuse a second pudding. But there were no guides for how to politely starve. And while politicians debated reforms, children in the East End grew up stunted, malnourished, and destined for the workhouse. This contrast between abundance and deprivation didn't just shape diets, it shaped society. Malnutrition made workers weaker, diseases spread faster in cramped tenements, and hunger fueled resentment that would eventually pressure governments to introduce social reforms. By the end of the Victorian era, Britain saw improvements in sanitation, the beginnings of free school meals, and greater awareness of the link between poverty and public health. But during Victoria's reign, the contrast was painfully clear. While one woman could demand sponge cake at will, millions of her subjects couldn't demand a second slice of bread. So, what did 3 meals a day mean in Victorian Britain? For the Queen, it meant breakfast tables buckling under eggs, fish, and jam, luncheons with roast game, and dinners stretching to midnight. For the poor, it often meant breakfast, hope, and disappointment. One class treated meals as theatre, politics, and ceremony rolled into one. The other treated meals as a question of survival. The royal appetite became both a celebration of empire and a symbol of its blind spots. Victoria's dinners dazzled diplomats, impressed foreign monarchs, and reinforced Britain's status as a world power. But for the average worker, those same dinners were a reminder that while Britain ruled the waves, it couldn't guarantee a full stomach at home. In the end, the Queen's dining table tells us as much about the Victorian world as the steam engine or the telegraph. It was a time of progress and prosperity, but also inequality and hunger. For every feast in the palace there was famine in the slums. And if that isn't the most Victorian contrast imaginable, I don't know what is. Before humanity figured out that clay tablets, ink, or alphabets could preserve our thoughts, we had only one tool for storing knowledge: the human brain. That's right, every poem, every epic, every "don't eat those berries unless you want to spend the night regretting your life choices" was locked inside someone's skull. And if that person forgot, misremembered, or got eaten by a lion, well, so much for the family archive. This was the age of oral tradition, where information was passed from mouth to ear like the world's longest and most serious game of telephone. Cultures relied on storytellers, bards, elders, and occasionally the village gossip who had the memory of an elephant. They were the human hard drives of their time. But unlike your computer, you couldn't just click save. Instead, you had to rely on rhythm, rhyme, and repetition to keep stories alive. That's why early tales and epics often sounded like they were written by people obsessed with poetry, because they kind of were. Repetition made things stick. Think of it like the ancient world's version of a catchy jingle. Once you've heard it enough, it's stuck forever. Now, oral tradition had its strengths. It allowed stories to evolve and adapt. The Odyssey, the Iliad, and countless other myths began as oral sagas, polished over generations by storytellers who weren't afraid to throw in a dramatic pause or two. The downside: facts were negotiable. If great-grandpa fought one wolf in reality, by the 5th retelling it was probably a pack of wolves, and by the 10th he was wrestling dragons. The good news: your ancestors always sounded cooler. The bad news: historians now have migraines. But oral tradition wasn't the only way early humans tried to leave their mark. Long before alphabets, before hieroglyphs, and even before clay tablets, we had cave paintings, found in places like Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain. These images of bison, deer, handprints, and mysterious symbols are humanity's first attempt at visual storytelling. Imagine them as the original PowerPoint presentations, slides etched on stone, complete with stick figures and bonus bison clip art. Were they religious? Hunting guides? Bored teenagers doodling because Netflix hadn't been invented yet? Scholars still argue. Some believe the paintings were spiritual rituals, magical thinking to help ensure a successful hunt. Others argue they were teaching tools. See this animal? Don't get too close, or you'll end up tomorrow's lunch. And some think they were, quite simply, ancient graffiti. In other words, Thog was here. Regardless of their purpose, these paintings reveal something fundamental. Humans desperately wanted to communicate beyond the present moment. A hunter could point to a cave wall and say, "See, that's the beast I nearly took down yesterday. Ignore the fact that it looks more like a potato on legs, I swear it was majestic." These images were memory anchors, a way of saying, "Don't forget this." Because without written words, forgetting was a constant threat. And that brings us back to the problem of memory. Imagine if your family history depended entirely on your uncle, who can't even remember where he put his sandals. Entire genealogies could vanish if one storyteller had a bad day or skipped a detail. Cultures had to invent elaborate methods of preserving accuracy. Epic poems like those of Homer weren't just long for dramatic flair. They were long because that's what it took to engrave them in memory. Meter, rhyme, rhythm. These were not artistic luxuries, but survival tools for information. But even with those tools, mistakes happened. Myths twisted, details warped. Oral tradition gave us beautiful epics, yes, but it also gave us centuries of wildly inaccurate stories. It's why we have versions of the same myth where the hero wins gloriously, and others where he dies embarrassingly. Ancient storytellers weren't liars, they were editors with flair. Now, before you pity these pre-writing societies, think of the upside. No bills, no written contracts, no terms and conditions you forgot to read. You couldn't be held accountable for anything written in fine print, because fine print didn't exist yet. That promise you made to return a goat, if no one remembered, congratulations, you're off the hook. On the other hand, if everyone remembered, you'd better deliver that goat before the community decided your memory lapse looked suspiciously like theft. In short, life before writing was precarious. Cultures thrived or withered depending on the reliability of their memory keepers. Legends survived not because they were perfectly true, but because they were compelling enough to be remembered. And humans, being humans, were much better at remembering dramatic tales of gods, monsters, and heroes than at remembering, say, the exact amount of barley owed to the local chief. That's why eventually humanity realized memory and doodles weren't enough. Oral tradition could entertain, and cave paintings could awe, but neither could guarantee accuracy. People wanted permanence, they wanted receipts, they wanted a way to say, "No, really, you owe me 3 goats, and here's the proof in clay." But that leap into permanence, the birth of actual writing, comes later in our story. For now, picture humanity in its first chapter, gathered around fires, painting on stone, reciting epics that grew a little grander with each telling, and hoping that someone, anyone, remembered the ending correctly. The good news? These traditions gave us myths and legends still told today. The bad news? If you asked an ancient bard for directions, you might get a 10-hour epic about a hero's journey instead of a clear path to the nearest river. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia decided that relying on memory was just not cutting it anymore. Too many goats were forgotten, too many grain debts went missing, and too many merchants claimed they'd definitely paid their taxes last week. The solution? Writing. Not poetry, not philosophy, not lofty declarations of love. Nope. Writing was born for the most boring, soul-crushing purpose imaginable: accounting. Humanity's first written words weren't about gods or heroes, they were receipts. Welcome to Cuneiform, which literally means wedge-shaped. The Sumerians figured out that if you press a reed stylus into wet clay, you can make little wedge marks, line them up, and suddenly you've got a system for recording information. It wasn't elegant calligraphy. It looked more like a chicken had tap danced across a tablet. But it worked. The very first writing system in history was essentially the ancient version of Excel. Neat rows of marks, columns of grain tallies, and no mercy for your aching wrist. The earliest cuneiform tablets read like the shopping lists of civilization: 2 jars of beer, 6 sheep, 1 debt that will never be repaid, probably. You might expect humanity's first written words to be something inspiring like, "Let there be wisdom." Instead, the oldest deciphered cuneiform tablets say things closer to, "Delivery 10 baskets of wheat, paid none." So yes, writing was invented because humans couldn't resist nagging each other about barley, and with that, bureaucracy was born. Entire armies of scribes spent their lives hunched over clay tablets recording trades, debts, and rations. Forget glamour. Being a scribe was the Mesopotamian equivalent of spending your whole life at a DMV desk. But here's the thing. In a world where almost no one else could read or write, scribes had power. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge. The ones who could prove that yes, actually, you really did owe a temple priest 2 goats and an amphora of beer. Without scribes, the economy collapsed. With scribes, civilization ticked on. Now, clay might not sound like the most practical writing material, but it had some perks. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it lasted. Unlike paper or parchment, which decays, baked clay can survive millennia. That's why archaeologists today can read Sumerian shopping lists from 5,000 years ago, but have no idea what their own grandparents' grocery lists looked like. The durability of clay gave us history. It also gave us proof that the human race has always been obsessed with beer, but cuneiform didn't stay just about barley and sheep. Over centuries it grew more complex. What began as pictographs, little drawings of objects, gradually evolved into abstract signs that represented sounds, ideas, and syllables. With over 1,000 symbols in circulation, mastering cuneiform was not for the faint of heart. Learning it took years of training, and mistakes weren't easily erased. If you messed up, you had to smooth over the clay and start again, cursing your reed stylus and questioning your life choices. Cuneiform also opened the door for the first written laws, treaties, and literature, the Code of Ur-Nammu and later the Code of Hammurabi. 2 of the earliest known law codes were written in cuneiform. These weren't bedtime stories. They were more like, if you poke out someone's eye, they get to poke out yours. Next case. Writing meant laws could now be set in clay, literally. Justice wasn't just the whim of a ruler anymore. It was baked into tablets. And let's not forget literature. Thanks to cuneiform, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature. Without clay tablets, we'd never know about Gilgamesh, the ancient king who went on quests, wrestled monsters, and failed spectacularly at becoming immortal. It's basically the prototype for every hero's journey since. So while cuneiform began as receipts, it eventually became the tool that gave us myths, prayers, and epic poetry. Albeit still written in squiggly wedge marks that look suspiciously like a toddler's attempt at doodling. Still, for the average Mesopotamian, writing meant one thing: more paperwork. Taxes, rations, trade deals, temple donations. It was all there, recorded forever. If oral tradition was humanity's memory, cuneiform was humanity's first paper trail. You couldn't talk your way out of debts anymore, because the tablet didn't forget. And unlike your forgetful uncle from Chapter 1, the clay was a much more reliable historian. The downside? These tablets were heavy. If you think lugging around a laptop is annoying, imagine carrying an archive made entirely of bricks. Scholars have found entire libraries of clay tablets, thousands of them stacked like dusty stone encyclopedias. The library of Ashurbanipal alone had over 30,000 clay tablets. Imagine a library where every book is a brick, and dropping one on your foot isn't just annoying, it's a trip to the ancient physician. Yet, despite the inconvenience, Cuneiform gave humanity its first taste of permanence. No longer was history subject to the shaky memory of storytellers. Now, agreements could outlive the people who made them. Writing was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. Kings could record their victories, temples could preserve prayers, and merchants could keep track of who was terrible at paying their debts. In short, Cuneiform was the start of civilization's filing cabinet. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't poetic, but it was revolutionary. With a simple reed stylus and some clay, the Sumerians changed history forever. The good news? Humanity had finally figured out how to store knowledge outside the brain. The bad news? That knowledge was mostly about sheep, taxes, and more sheep. Or to put it another way, Cuneiform was basically Excel, but without the copy-paste function, just a sore wrist and a lot of clay. Once humanity had clay tablets and wedge-shaped marks to track sheep and beer, a different civilization decided that writing could be a little more glamorous. Enter the Egyptians, who around 3100 BCE developed hieroglyphs, a writing system that looked less like a receipt and more like the fanciest comic strip you've ever seen. Each symbol wasn't just a letter, it could be a picture of a bird, a snake, the sun, a loaf of bread, or a guy with a suspiciously large beard. Basically, if ancient Egyptians had Instagram, hieroglyphs would have been the perfect emoji set. Hieroglyphs were more than cute doodles, they were phonetic, meaning some pictures represented sounds rather than objects. A picture of an owl might stand for the M sound. A squiggly line could represent water. And yes, there were hundreds of these symbols. Learning hieroglyphs was a full-time job. If you weren't careful, a single squiggle could change the meaning of an entire sentence. Mix up a loaf of bread and a stick figure, and suddenly you're declaring war instead of ordering lunch. Precision mattered, or at least precision mattered, if you wanted anyone to understand you. For the Egyptians, writing served multiple purposes. First, it was religious. Temples were adorned with elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions that detailed rituals, prayers, and offerings to the gods. Priests used writing as a magical tool, believing that putting words on stone could influence the divine. So if you ever complain that your handwriting is bad, remember, Egyptians thought sloppy hieroglyphs could anger a god. Talk about pressure. Second, hieroglyphs were used for tombs. Pharaohs didn't just want to be remembered, they wanted to be remembered forever, in color, on stone, and with dramatic flair. Tomb walls became a canvas for glorifying rulers, illustrating their victories, their feasts, and occasionally their slightly embarrassing moments, though the pharaohs probably edited those out. The message was clear: look at me. I conquered nations, fed the gods, and lived fabulously. Also, my afterlife is going to be amazing. Please leave offerings. And third, hieroglyphs were a perfect way to brag about yourself. If you were a pharaoh, general, or noble, why write a simple "I did some stuff" when you could illustrate it? Hieroglyphs allowed Egyptians to combine text and imagery to tell stories that were simultaneously informative, decorative, and slightly boastful. Imagine writing a grocery list in hieroglyphs: 3 ducks, 1 son, and a guy with a suspiciously large beard. Then imagine that list carved in stone and placed in your tomb forever. That's commitment. Of course, hieroglyphs came with their own challenges. For one, they weren't exactly easy to read. Over the centuries, scripts evolved: hieratic, a cursive version for everyday writing on papyrus, and demotic, even faster shorthand appeared, leaving the original hieroglyphs mostly for ceremonial purposes. By the time the Romans showed up in Egypt, Hieroglyphs had largely become a mysterious, almost magical script. Without knowing the rules, the symbols were indecipherable, essentially a giant puzzle, or as some scholars described it, Egypt's ultimate escape room, and indeed, for over a millennium, no one outside of Egypt could read a single hieroglyph. Scholars and adventurers could only guess at the meanings. Some thought hieroglyphs were purely symbolic. Others tried to pronounce them phonetically but inevitably butchered the words. It wasn't until 1799, when Napoleon's troops discovered the Rosetta Stone, that everything changed. This black basalt slab contained the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs, providing the key that allowed linguists, most famously Jean-François Champollion, to finally crack the code. Suddenly, the walls of tombs and temples could speak again, revealing centuries of prayers, rituals, and dramatic royal boasting. Hieroglyphs also taught us something profound about how humans view writing. Unlike the Sumerians, who invented writing for practical reasons, the Egyptians approached it as both an art form and a status symbol. Writing could be beautiful, meaningful, and permanent. Hieroglyphs weren't just about communication, they were about immortality. If a pharaoh could have a perfectly drawn scene of himself defeating enemies carved in stone, he didn't need a biography. The symbols would shout it louder than any mortal ever could. And yet, the beauty of hieroglyphs masked a practical side. While stone inscriptions were ceremonial, papyrus scrolls allowed for correspondence, administrative records, and literature. Egyptians wrote letters, business contracts, and even instructional texts. Hieroglyphs weren't just for gods and kings, they also tracked ordinary life, though usually in a more compressed cursive form. They were as versatile as they were elegant, capable of recording both the mundane and the divine. In short, hieroglyphs were humanity's first attempt at combining art, language, and storytelling into a single medium. They were expressive, precise, and sometimes utterly confusing. They allowed the Egyptians to immortalize themselves, please their gods, and occasionally confuse future archaeologists for centuries. The good news: hieroglyphs gave us some of the most beautiful and enduring art and literature in human history. The bad news: without the Rosetta Stone, we would still be guessing whether that guy with the enormous beard on the tomb wall was a pharaoh, a priest, or someone who really liked ducks. By around 1000 BCE, humanity had mastered clay tablets, hieroglyphs, and scribes with sore wrists, but one problem remained. Writing was still a pain. Thousands of symbols, hundreds of signs, and countless variations meant that literacy was an elite skill. Ordinary people, merchants, and travelers were effectively locked out of the written word. Enter the Phoenicians, a seafaring trading civilization that said, "Enough with the complex symbols, let's make this simple." The Phoenicians invented the first alphabet, a set of roughly 24 symbols that represented sounds instead of objects. Each symbol was a building block for speech, which meant you could combine them to write any word. Suddenly, writing wasn't about memorizing hundreds of pictographs or scribal codes, it was about learning a manageable set of letters. For the first time, literacy had a chance of spreading beyond priests, bureaucrats, and the occasional ambitious noble. In essence, the Phoenicians gave humanity its first efficiency upgrade. The brilliance of the Phoenician alphabet lay in its simplicity. Rather than drawing a duck to mean duck or a snake to mean danger, each symbol corresponded to a sound. One symbol might represent B, another K, and so on. You combined them like Lego blocks to form words. Writing became modular, flexible, and shockingly practical. Merchants could record transactions, sailors could log journeys, and ordinary people could, in theory, jot a note without spending decades training in scribal school. It was the original democratization of literacy. But the Phoenician system wasn't perfect. It only recorded consonants. That's right, vowels were missing. You could write something like MLK and hope readers guessed whether you meant Malik, king, Melek, also king, but slightly different dialect, or milk. And yes, people did actually write grocery lists. For most daily purposes, consonants were enough, especially for trade. But poetry, literature, and love letters required a little more nuance. Humans being humans, someone inevitably said, What if we could make this better? Enter the Greeks. Around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks borrowed the Phoenician alphabet and added vowels. Suddenly, writing could represent the full range of spoken language. Every sound could be precisely notated, which meant reading became easier and misinterpretation decreased. No more guessing whether MLK meant king or milk. Now you could write Malakos or Galactos, and your readers would understand exactly what you meant. The alphabet had evolved from a functional tool into a genuinely expressive system. The Greeks also demonstrated how powerful writing could be for culture. Literature, philosophy, and science all became far more accessible. Epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey could now be written in a standardized system. Teachers could instruct without needing to draw elaborate pictographs. Philosophers could debate ideas in writing, and merchants could finally create contracts without fear that their audience would misinterpret a duck as a loaf of bread. Efficiency had arrived, but the alphabet's most famous adopters were the Romans. They took the Greek system, adapted it for Latin, and spread it across Europe. Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators carried the alphabet to every corner of the empire, from Spain to Syria. Suddenly, writing was no longer the secret tool of scribes or priests. Ordinary people, well, those who had the time and motivation, could learn to read and write. The alphabet had gone mainstream. It became the backbone of European literacy for millennia. The revolution of the alphabet wasn't just about practicality. It changed the way humans thought about language. With fewer symbols, words became more modular, writing became faster, more adaptable, and easier to teach. Communication expanded beyond elite circles, enabling trade, diplomacy, education, and storytelling at a scale never seen before. Imagine a world where merchants could finally write down their inventories without needing a decade of training in pictographs. Efficiency had never looked so good or so flat, depending on how you view the letters. And let's not forget the cultural impact. The alphabet made writing personalizable. Love letters could be written without hiring a priest who only knew how to write in cryptic bird symbols. Household notes, recipes, warnings about snakes in the pantry, all of these could be communicated in a way that everyone with a basic understanding of the alphabet could read. In short, the alphabet turned writing into a tool that could touch every aspect of life, from commerce to romance. Yet, as powerful as it was, the alphabet didn't eliminate all challenges. Handwriting remained labor-intensive, literacy was still not universal, and learning even a modest alphabet required discipline. But compared to the cumbersome, symbol-heavy systems of clay tablets and hieroglyphs, it was a revelation. Suddenly, humans had discovered writing that could keep up with speech, capture nuance, and be learned by ordinary people instead of just temple scribes. In conclusion, the invention of the alphabet was a triumph of simplicity and utility. The Phoenicians gave humanity a functional set of symbols. The Greeks added vowels, enabling expressive and precise communication. The Romans spread it, ensuring that literacy could, in theory, be within reach of anyone willing to learn. Writing had finally stepped out of the exclusive domain of elites and into the hands of everyday humans. The good news? The alphabet was revolutionary. Finally, you could write a love letter without hiring a priest who only wrote in cryptic bird symbols. The bad news? Humans now had no excuse for bad handwriting. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered a period sometimes charmingly referred to as the Dark Ages. Libraries crumbled, literacy shrank, and the knowledge of classical civilizations teetered on the brink of oblivion. Fortunately, a determined group of people, monks, took it upon themselves to preserve humanity's intellectual heritage. Their weapon of choice? Ink, parchment, and sheer endurance. Monastic scribes spent hours each day hunched over wooden desks, copying texts by hand. And when I say hours, I mean it literally. Day after day, week after week, year after year, one book could take decades to complete. Think about that for a moment. If you wanted a copy of a single Bible, it could outlast several generations of your family. The monks' lives became a relentless cycle of writing, correcting, and praying that the quill didn't splatter ink across the sacred page. These scribes weren't just copying words, they were also creating illuminated manuscripts, the medieval equivalent of combining a textbook with a gallery exhibit. Imagine reading the Psalms while being distracted by dazzling gold leaf, intricate borders, and tiny little angels doing cartwheels in the margins. The artistry was breathtaking, but it came at a cost. Every flourish, every painted capital, required time, skill, and patience. One misplaced brushstroke could ruin hours of labor, and yet monks persisted, driven by devotion, duty, or perhaps a fear that God wouldn't appreciate sloppy handwriting. Parchment itself added another layer of complexity. Made from treated animal skins, usually sheep, goats, or calves, it was expensive, delicate, and oddly resistant to perfection. Monks had to prepare each sheet meticulously, scraping, stretching, and smoothing until it was suitable for ink. Mistakes weren't easily corrected. A spilled drop of ink or a miscopied letter could mean scraping the surface or starting a page from scratch. There was no backspace key, no undo button, just endless persistence and an escalating risk of hand cramps. Speaking of hand cramps, let's talk about the physical toll. Monks basically invented carpal tunnel syndrome, one psalm at a time. Hours of holding quills, dipping them in ink, and forming precise letters left scribes with stiff fingers, sore wrists, and probably a lot of complaints about medieval ergonomics. Yet despite the discomfort, monasteries became hubs of intellectual preservation. Without these tireless scribes, works of literature, philosophy, and science from antiquity might have vanished entirely. Virgil, Plato, Aristotle, and countless others survived thanks to the repetitive hand movements of individuals who probably wished they'd become farmers instead. But copying texts wasn't merely a mechanical task, it was also an act of devotion. In many monasteries, the process of writing was considered spiritual practice. Monks meditated on each word, viewing transcription as a form of prayer. Every letter carried significance. Errors weren't just mistakes, they were spiritual failings. This combination of artistry, piety, and physical strain created books that were as beautiful as they were functional. In a way, the monks were early inventors of multitasking, artist, scribe, theologian, and contortionist, all rolled into one. Monks didn't just copy religious texts either. They preserved classical works on history, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Latin was the lingua franca, but they also worked in Greek, Hebrew, and occasionally vernacular languages. Their libraries became repositories of knowledge, carefully catalogued and protected, often in fortified monasteries. Some texts traveled hundreds of miles, carried by monks on pilgrimages or diplomatic missions. They were humanity's first archivists, archivists who doubled as miniature endurance athletes. Illuminated manuscripts weren't just about text, they were visual storytelling. The illustrations served as teaching tools for the illiterate, helping readers understand stories through images. Kings, nobles, and wealthy patrons commissioned these books, which sometimes took multiple scribes and artists to complete. The process could span years or even decades, creating a sense of anticipation that rivals today's seasonal TV cliffhangers. When a manuscript was finally complete, it was a cultural event, a combination of scholarly achievement and art exhibition. Of course, this painstaking work meant that books were rare and valuable. Owning a complete Bible or a classical text was a mark of wealth and prestige. Most people would never see a manuscript in their lives. For the average medieval person, literacy remained distant, confined to monasteries and elite households. Writing had expanded beyond the elite scribes of ancient Rome, but it was still far from universal. In short, medieval manuscripts were a labor of love, devotion, and sheer stubbornness. They were the bridge between the classical world and the Renaissance, carrying forward the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The good news? Thanks to these medieval marathons of ink and parchment, humanity preserved literature, science, and religious texts for future generations. The bad news? If you ever complain about long projects or paperwork today, just remember monks spent decades copying the same psalm over and over, probably while grumbling under their breath and inventing medieval curse words. So next time you pick up a book, take a moment to appreciate the sweat, ink and carpal tunnel that went into it. One scribe's dedication is the reason we can read Virgil without deciphering a single squiggly wedge or tiny angel doing backflips in the margins. Monks weren't just copying books, they were keeping civilization alive, one cramped letter at a time. For over a millennium, books had been laboriously handwritten by monks in monasteries, each copy a rare treasure, painstakingly illuminated and almost always far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Owning a book was like owning a small mountain. If you were wealthy, a book could symbolize status, piety, and sophistication. If you weren't, your idea of reading might have been limited to memorizing a proverb or listening to a traveling storyteller. Then, in the 15th century, everything changed. Enter Johannes Gutenberg, a German inventor with a revolutionary idea. What if you could reproduce books mechanically instead of painstakingly copying them by hand? He didn't invent writing or ink or even paper, but he did invent the printing press with movable type, a clever system of individual letters that could be arranged, inked, pressed, and reused. It was like giving humanity its first Control-C, Control+V function, but in real life, with metal letters instead of a keyboard. Suddenly, producing multiple copies of a text no longer required decades of labor. Gutenberg could produce dozens of identical pages in a fraction of the time it would take a monk to laboriously copy a single manuscript. The first major work printed on his press was the Gutenberg Bible, around 1455. It retained the elegance of manuscripts with its careful layout and fine typography, but it could be reproduced faster and more consistently than any hand-copied book. The implications were staggering. For the first time in history, knowledge could escape the monastery and reach a wider audience. Books were no longer exclusive treasures. They could circulate. Scholars, merchants, and even curious laypeople had access to texts that had previously been confined to sacred libraries. The mass production of books sparked an explosion in literacy, learning, and cultural exchange. For centuries, access to texts had been controlled by monasteries, temples, and elite households. Now, common people who could read, had unprecedented opportunities to educate themselves. Schools could access textbooks, scholars could circulate scientific discoveries, religious ideas could reach audiences far beyond local parishes. The printing press essentially turbocharged communication in a way that had never been possible before. And as with all technological revolutions, there were unintended consequences. Suddenly, it was possible to print pamphlets, leaflets, and manuals that spread ideas like wildfire. Religious reformers like Martin Luther could challenge the Catholic Church with a speed previously unimaginable. Scientists could publish findings that others could replicate, accelerating the growth of knowledge. Even satirical or humorous works found wider audiences. In other words, the press didn't just print books, it democratized controversy. Everyone could now read opinions, argue about them, and respond in kind. The modern world of debate, dissent, and viral ideas had an unlikely ancestor in Gutenberg's workshop. Printing also changed the economics of books. Before the press, producing a single manuscript could cost the equivalent of a small fortune. After the press, the cost dropped dramatically. Books became more affordable, allowing more people to own them, read them, and even annotate them. Libraries began to expand beyond monasteries, and universities could stock more texts. Knowledge was no longer a static, elite possession. It was dynamic and increasingly public. You could argue that the printing press was the first social media platform for ideas without the annoying cat memes, though there were occasional medieval illustrations of lions eating people, which in context were basically memes. Of course, the process wasn't instantaneous. Printing still required skill. Typesetters had to arrange letters in reverse, ink them evenly, and press them carefully. Errors could propagate quickly, leading to some notorious early misprints. But even with its quirks, the printing press marked a radical shift. It transformed writing from a painstakingly guarded treasure into a reproducible, shareable, and impactful tool. And the cultural effects were profound. Literacy rates gradually increased as more people had access to readable texts. Scientific methods became more standardized because instructions could be reliably replicated. Philosophical ideas spread across Europe, influencing debates in politics, religion, and art. The Renaissance flourished in part because people could now access the works of ancient Greece and Rome with far greater ease. Essentially, Gutenberg's press didn't just make books easier to copy, it made civilization faster, smarter, and a little more chaotic. The good news: suddenly, books weren't just luxury items for the wealthy elite. After the printing press, they were the 15th century version of going viral. Everyone wanted one, everyone talked about them, and ideas spread faster than ever. The bad news: if you thought misprinted words were frustrating today, imagine accidentally printing a whole run of pamphlets declaring that the local prince had 3 heads. Oops. In short, Gutenberg didn't just make books more efficient, he transformed writing into a revolutionary communication tool. He took the painstaking labor of monks, the beauty of illuminated manuscripts, and the cumbersome complexity of previous writing systems, and added speed, reproducibility, and accessibility. The printing press didn't just preserve knowledge, it spread it, multiplied it, and set the stage for every revolution in thought, religion, science, and literature that would follow. Before the press, reading a book was a rare privilege. After the press, reading a book became a possibility for anyone willing to learn. It was humanity's first step toward a world in which ideas could travel faster than armies, wisdom could outlast rulers, and controversy could go viral, even without social media. If you thought Gutenberg's printing press was a revolution, hold on to your smartphone, because in the last few centuries, writing has gone from elite craft to everywhere, all the time, and often in 280 characters or fewer. Humanity has traveled a long road from clay tablets to digital oversharing, and the journey is as fascinating as it is chaotic. The story begins with the typewriter, invented in the 19th century. Suddenly, you didn't need a scribe or a painstaking hand to produce legible text. Anyone could hammer out a letter, a report, or a novel with relative speed and uniformity. Typewriters standardized the look of written communication, which was a blessing for legibility and a curse for anyone who struggled with finger cramps. Authors could now churn out pages of prose without worrying about ink blotches or medieval carpal tunnel. Newspapers flourished, offices filled with clickety-clack sounds, and the written word became a tool for business, journalism, and creativity. But as efficient as typewriters were, they still required physical labor. You had to strike the keys, roll the paper, and correct mistakes with a bit of whiteout, or start over entirely. Still, it was a monumental leap from handwritten manuscripts, making writing faster, more accessible, and more consistent. The written word was no longer confined to monasteries, printing presses, or scholars. It was becoming part of everyday life. Then came the computer, which radically transformed the way humans create, edit, and distribute text. Gone were the days of fixing errors with whiteout. Now you could delete, copy, paste, and rearrange entire pages in seconds. Writing became not just faster, but infinitely more editable. Computers also enabled mass communication. Essays, reports, letters, and later blogs and emails could be shared almost instantly. Suddenly, your words weren't just on paper, they could reach someone hundreds or thousands of miles away in moments. Writing was leaving the page and entering the realm of real-time interaction. The next leap was the internet, which made writing not just instant but universal. Email, forums, chat rooms, and early social media created a world in which anyone could share ideas, opinions, or memes with millions of people. Writing ceased to be a carefully considered act. It became a form of immediate expression. Whether you were a scholar, a marketer, or a teenager with strong opinions about pizza toppings, your words could travel farther and faster than Gutenberg ever imagined. Then came the age of text messaging and social media platforms, which compressed human expression into snippets, emojis, GIFs, and hashtags. Writing became a daily, sometimes hourly, habit for billions. People went from carefully crafting letters or manuscripts to sending rapid-fire updates about what they had for lunch, what mood they were in, or which cat video was funniest that day. The boundaries between private and public communication blurred. Writing was no longer a tool for preservation, instruction, or artistry. It had become an everywhere, all-the-time human reflex. This democratization of writing has some extraordinary consequences. On the positive side, anyone with access to a device can now document events, share ideas, advocate for change, and communicate instantly with the world. Social movements, education, and global collaboration have all benefited from the fact that the written word is no longer a privilege, it's a right and a reflex. You can instantly tell someone across the globe what you had for breakfast, why you disagree with a law, or which book changed your life, all in under 280 characters. On the flip side, writing has become overwhelmingly abundant. The sheer volume of words being produced daily is staggering. Millions of messages, posts, and emails flood servers continuously. Every random thought, every impulsive opinion, every cryptic emoji has a digital footprint. In a sense, humans have gone from preserving knowledge for posterity to documenting everything, including the most trivial moments of daily life. If clay tablets could talk, they'd probably look at our smartphones and groan, "We did not survive 5,000 years for this." And yet there is beauty in this chaos. Writing is now a tool for everyone, from Shakespearean enthusiasts typing on laptops to teenagers sending memes to friends. Literature, journalism, poetry, humor, and social commentary coexist with tweets about cats wearing hats. Humanity has turned writing into both a personal diary and a global megaphone. We've created a culture where sharing is reflexive, instantaneous, and sometimes ridiculous, but always human. The good news? We went from clay tablets to sending emojis of clay tablets in under 5,000 years. That's progress, efficiency, and a touch of irony all in one. The bad news? Every thought, every typo, every poorly phrased joke exists somewhere in the digital ether, forever immortalized, ready for archaeologists of the future to decipher and wonder what on earth we were thinking. From typewriters to computers, from the printing press to social media, humanity has learned that writing is no longer a privilege for the elite. It is our most universal tool, our daily companion, and sometimes our most relentless habit. It has empowered, informed, entertained, and occasionally overwhelmed us. Writing has gone from monumental, sacred manuscripts to lightning-fast messages sent in seconds. It has traveled from monasteries to living rooms, from libraries to smartphones. It has become not just a method of communication, but a defining feature of what it means to be human. In the end, the story of writing is a story of adaptation, creativity, and relentless expansion. From grunts and cave doodles to instant messages and emojis, humanity has never stopped finding new ways to leave its mark, share its thoughts, and occasionally overshare. Long before anyone dreamed of strapping a tiny parasol to their head, humans were already obsessed with covering their heads. Protection from the sun, rain, or just the occasional falling twig has been a concern since prehistoric times. Imagine early humans squinting at the sky, muttering, "Maybe I should find something for my head," while fashion, utility, and survival collided in the most basic form of innovation, head coverings. The earliest hats were practical and rudimentary. Early humans likely used animal hides, leaves, or woven grasses to shield themselves from the elements. These were the first proto-hats, handmade, functional, and impressively utilitarian. Unlike today's fashion-conscious choices, ancient hats were about survival. Picture a Neanderthal fashion show, one contestant with a moss crown, another with a hollowed-out gourd, and a third sporting a pile of leaves that definitely didn't match the landscape. The audience? Probably a curious wolf pack or a bewildered mammoth. As civilizations developed, so did sophistication. In ancient Egypt, the sun was relentless, and pharaohs weren't just looking for shade, they wanted to look impressive while staying cool. Egyptians used elaborate head coverings from linen caps to wide, flat sunshades, sometimes decorated with beads and gold. These hats were as much about status as practicality. Ordinary Egyptians had simpler coverings, like straw hats, which were functional but had the added bonus of making one look like a walking bundle of reeds. Humorous thought. Imagine workers in the fields trying to balance sun protection with dignity, only to end up resembling a very polite scarecrow. Across the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamians embraced their own head-covering innovations. Woven turbans and conical hats kept the desert sun at bay, while also signaling one's role or social class. A priest, a merchant, and a farmer might all wear head coverings, but each one communicated a very different message. A merchant with a floppy straw hat might be trying to sell clay pots, while a priest's tall, structured headpiece screamed, "I command the gods and also moderate the rain schedule." Function and messaging were inseparable, even in fashion. Farther east, ancient China saw straw hats become an essential part of agrarian life. Farmers bent over rice paddies, or walking along muddy paths needed sun protection and a means to shed rain. Wide-brimmed conical hats, often tied under the chin with strings, became iconic. Not only did these hats protect the wearer, but they also doubled as portable baskets in some cases, perfect for harvesting small crops or temporarily holding a frog or two. Efficiency and absurd practicality, two traits humanity would later bring to the umbrella hat. Throughout these early civilizations, head coverings were also a cultural symbol. Beyond utility, they conveyed status, occupation, or religious meaning. For example, certain colors or shapes were reserved for royalty, clergy, or warriors. Wearing the wrong hat could lead to social embarrassment, or worse, a very awkward public scolding. If you thought modern fashion faux pas were bad, imagine accidentally wearing a peasant's hat to the pharaoh's court. The horror. It wasn't just sun or rain that inspired creativity. Wind, dust storms, and even minor snowfall demanded solutions. People improvised, from animal skins draped over heads to straw hats reinforced with reeds. Early humans displayed incredible ingenuity in engineering portable shelters, long before the term hands-free even existed. While the umbrella hat wouldn't be invented for thousands of years, the seeds of its absurd brilliance were already being planted. Humanity clearly loved convenience, freedom of movement, and occasionally looking a bit ridiculous. Humor and aesthetics were rarely forgotten. Even in ancient societies, there's evidence that people enjoyed decorating their hats with feathers, beads, or symbolic carvings. These weren't just vanity items, they also signaled identity, allegiance, or personal taste. A farmer with a feathered straw hat might have been showing off a sense of style, or just trying to keep a bird from landing on his head. Either way, head coverings combined protection, identity, and a hint of comedy long before umbrella hats made it cool, or at least laughable. By the end of this early era, humanity had mastered the art of head protection. We had sun shields, rain shields, and everything in between. Functionality was king, but flair was never far behind. These ancient inventions laid the foundation for one of history's most delightfully impractical ideas, the umbrella hat. It may look silly, but in many ways it's the culmination of thousands of years of human ingenuity, practicality, and a stubborn desire to keep one's hands free. The good news? Humans have always been creative when it comes to staying dry or avoiding sunburn. The bad news? Some of those solutions, like a moss crown or a gourd helmet, probably didn't survive the test of fashion. And yet here we are, centuries later, strapping tiny umbrellas to our heads, proving once again that if you can dream it, humans will find a way to make it slightly ridiculous. Before the umbrella hat, humans were basically wearing whatever looked like a failed parasol on their heads, and honestly, some of them probably should have just stayed indoors. Long before anyone dreamed of strapping a tiny umbrella to their head, humanity invented the umbrella itself. Yes, the humble umbrella started as a tool to shield one from the elements, not a novelty item or fashion statement, although fashion would catch up eventually. Its history stretches back thousands of years, spanning continents and cultures, each adding their own twist to the simple idea of a collapsible canopy. The earliest known umbrellas come from ancient Egypt, where they were primarily used as sunshades called parasols. Pharaohs and nobles carried elaborately decorated parasols, made from palm leaves or linen, often supported by wooden or reed shafts. The practical purpose was clear: to keep the sun from bleaching your skin or your dignity. But there was also a social aspect. The more ornate and tall your parasol, the more powerful you looked. Imagine a noble walking down the Nile, holding a parasol so large that passing merchants had to duck. Status, protection, and intimidation all bundled under a single canopy. It was basically a royal scepter of shade, and historians suspect pharaohs used it to silently assert dominance over both son and subjects. Farther east, ancient China developed a sophisticated umbrella culture that included both rain and sun protection. Early Chinese umbrellas were often made of silk, paper, and bamboo, and could be treated with oil to make them waterproof. These weren't casual items. You didn't just grab one on a whim. They were carefully crafted, portable, and in many cases ceremonial. Chinese texts from around 11th century BCE describe umbrellas being used in official processions, symbolizing both status and reverence. The umbrella's role as a symbol of prestige was firmly established. It was a practical tool that also screamed, "I am important, and I will not get wet." The Greeks and Romans also embraced umbrellas, mostly for sun protection, though rain was occasionally considered. Called scaphos or umbraculum, they were often collapsible, much like modern umbrellas. Wealthy citizens and philosophers alike used them while strolling city streets or attending public forums. A Greek philosopher debating ethics might have been just as concerned about sunstroke as about morality, and the umbrella was there to protect both his head and his sensibilities. Greek umbrellas were practical, yes, but they also became fashion statements, a trend that the Romans happily adopted and improved upon. But umbrellas were more than just protection. They were power symbols. In many societies, carrying an umbrella or parasol was akin to wielding a miniature throne overhead. People didn't just carry umbrellas, they paraded them. Imagine striding through a muddy street, holding a collapsible canopy like a royal staff, leaving pedestrians and livestock alike in awe. As one historian quipped, people carried umbrellas like royal scepters because nothing says "I rule this puddle" like a collapsible stick of water defense. The umbrella became a statement: I am prepared, I am elite, and I am not a fan of rain-induced bad hair days. The transition from purely handheld umbrellas to the concept of hands-free protection also began here. As umbrellas became common tools, humans started to experiment. Could it be attached to the arm? Could it be tied to a staff or a cart? The idea of freeing the hands while remaining dry was already percolating in the minds of inventors and craftsmen. Even in ancient illustrations, you can see attempts to combine mobility, shade, and shelter in one device. One can only imagine the first proto-hands-free prototypes, awkward wooden contraptions balanced on heads, swinging dangerously in the wind. Practicality sometimes clashed spectacularly with physics, and comedy was inevitable. Umbrellas also had technological variations in their ancient forms. Some had folding mechanisms, while others were rigid and ornate. Some were small and portable. Others were massive, requiring attendants to carry them for nobility. Across cultures, innovation focused on materials and durability. Silk for elegance, oil coatings for water resistance, bamboo for flexibility, and metals for reinforcement. Each society tailored the umbrella to its environment, social hierarchy, and aesthetic taste, resulting in a device that was both functional and culturally expressive. Interestingly, early umbrellas also influenced the concept of personal space and mobility. A person carrying a parasol created a bubble of dry and shaded space around themselves, a kind of prehistoric social distancing. In bustling streets or crowded courts, umbrellas literally pushed others away, granting a small measure of comfort and privacy. It's easy to see how this early obsession with canopy size, angle, and stability eventually evolved into the idea, why not just strap this thing to my head and free my hands? By the end of this early period, the umbrella had firmly established itself as a practical and symbolic invention. It provided shelter, conveyed status, allowed for controlled personal space, and even flirted with early concepts of hands-free utility. Ancient humans, whether in Egypt, China, or Greece, had demonstrated that protection from rain and sun could also be a statement of style, power, and ingenuity. Little did they know that centuries later, this logic would culminate in the fully hands-free, head-mounted absurdity we now call the umbrella hat. The good news? Umbrellas have always made life easier and occasionally more stylish. The bad news? They were also the perfect prelude to humans deciding that if we can carry it, we can eventually strap it to our skulls, and thus, the first seeds of the umbrella hat were planted. People carried umbrellas like royal scepters, because nothing says "I rule this puddle" like a collapsible stick of water defense. By the time umbrellas were firmly established as both practical tools and status symbols, a natural question arose: why not free your hands entirely? If humans had already figured out collapsible canopies, folding mechanisms, and waterproof fabrics, surely someone could just strap the thing to their head, or shoulder, or belt. This curiosity sparked a long and often absurd history of hands-free umbrella experimentation, long before the term umbrella hat entered anyone's vocabulary. The first mentions of hands-free devices appear in late 19th century newspapers and patent applications, mostly in Europe and the United States. Inventors, often fueled by boredom, ingenuity, or the belief that walking in the rain without getting wet should be effortless, began designing attachments that could hold an umbrella above the user without occupying their hands. Early sketches resemble something between wearable hats and medieval siege engines. Wires, rods, straps, and fabric forming precarious frameworks that could either shield a single person or topple with a gust of wind. Victorian inventors were particularly enthusiastic. The late 1800s were an era obsessed with practical innovations and elaborate contraptions, often with little concern for aesthetics. People were tinkering with bicycles, corsets, and steam-powered everything, so why not a self-supporting umbrella? Some prototypes were attached to the shoulder, using leather straps and counterweights to balance the canopy above the head. Others were connected to belts, creating the first portable rain shields that extended like tiny tents over one's torso. One can only imagine the early adopters waddling down cobblestone streets, awkwardly trying to maintain balance while avoiding hitting pedestrians or lampposts. The struggle was immediate and universal: practicality versus absurdity. Every hands-free umbrella inventor faced the same problem. If it works, it looks ridiculous. If it looks respectable, it rarely keeps you dry. Victorian observers reportedly described early wearable umbrellas as curious contraptions that make the wearer resemble a mobile gazebo. Fashion commentators were not impressed. "Attach it to the head, the back, the belt," one inventor reportedly exclaimed. "Sure, it will shield you from the rain." The fashion police seemed to reply collectively, groaning. Yet inventors persisted. In the early 20th century, patents began emerging with increasing frequency. Some designs featured spring-loaded arms that could adjust the umbrella height, while others used articulated joints to swing the canopy aside when entering a doorway. Imagine a man trying to duck under a shop awning while a fully extended umbrella rig pivots like a mechanical bird. Engineering triumph. Comedic disaster. The public reception was mixed. Amused curiosity, skeptical laughter, and occasional admiration for sheer ingenuity. Newspapers printed illustrations showing these inventions in action, often accompanied by witty captions about the perils of walking in public during a sudden rainstorm. Materials were also a challenge. Early umbrella fabrics were often heavy, and metal spokes added weight and complexity. Designers struggled to create something light enough for comfort, yet sturdy enough to survive wind gusts. Many prototypes relied on leather straps, wooden rods, and metal braces, producing a contraption that could protect the wearer but risk turning them into a human windmill in a gust. Some inventors even toyed with counterweights or pulley systems to stabilize the umbrella above the head, a mechanical sophistication that probably impressed engineers more than pedestrians. Interestingly, these experiments were not limited to rainy weather. Some inventors envisioned hands-free parasols for sunny days, creating wearable sunshades that doubled as a personal comfort device. Beachgoers, golfers, and picnickers could, in theory, enjoy shade without holding a parasol. Though execution often resulted in collapsed umbrellas, tangled straps, or minor neck injuries, it was clear that while the concept was brilliant, the world wasn't quite ready for widespread adoption, nor were fashion sensibilities. Despite the comedic failures, these early experiments paved the way for the modern umbrella hat. They established the principle that a canopy could exist independently of one's hands, and hinted at the human desire for convenience at all costs, even if it meant looking absurd in public. This principle continues to this day. If it frees the hands and keeps one dry, designers are willing to risk ridicule. The historical takeaway is that innovation often involves trial, error, and a great deal of awkwardness. Engineers and inventors kept trying, adjusting, and redesigning, all in pursuit of a device that would allow someone to walk in the rain without holding anything. They didn't mind looking strange. The challenge of merging function, form, and freedom of movement was worth it. And humorously, the more ridiculous these inventions looked, the more fascinated the public became. The good news: humans have always been willing to experiment with outrageous solutions to minor problems. The bad news: some of these experiments made the wearer look like a cross between a gazebo and a mobile windmill. Yet, through these trials and tribulations, the idea of a hands-free umbrella slowly took shape, setting the stage for the iconic novelty that would eventually enter pop culture: the umbrella hat. Engineers kept trying. Attach it to the head, the back, the belt, and the fashion police collectively groaned. The moment humanity finally decided that strapping a miniature umbrella to one's head was a viable idea came in the 20th century, and as with many brilliant inventions, it started with a patent. The modern umbrella hat as we know it began to appear in official records around the 1920s and 1930s, when inventive minds were experimenting with convenience, portability, and a certain flair for the absurd. For someone in the midst of a rainy walk, a hands-free canopy seemed like a godsend, an answer to the eternal question, why hold something over my head when I could wear it instead? Patents from this era reveal the inventor's obsession with engineering a functional, wearable device. The basic design was surprisingly consistent: a central hub or crown, lightweight metal spokes, a piece of waterproof fabric, and a system of straps to keep it securely atop the wearer's head. Some early versions featured adjustable hinges to allow the umbrella to tilt forward or backward, accommodating different head sizes, windy conditions, and seated positions. Designers were determined to create a product that would keep rain off the wearer without turning them into a human windmill. Though in practice, the balance between function and flamboyance was delicate. Commercial production soon followed. By the mid-20th century, umbrella hats were being sold in novelty stores, sporting goods shops, and at fairs. Manufacturers marketed them as practical, recreational, and hands-free solutions for outdoor activities. Fishermen loved them. No longer did they have to juggle a rod, tackle box, and an umbrella. Picnic goers, festival attendees, and even enthusiastic parade watchers could now enjoy the outdoors while keeping their hands free for snacks, flags, or waving dramatically at passers-by. The umbrella hat was functional, yes, but also inherently social, often drawing laughs, curious glances, and the occasional photograph. The materials used were carefully chosen for a combination of lightweight durability and cost-effectiveness. Thin metal spokes formed the skeleton, strong enough to support the fabric yet flexible enough to withstand gusts. The canopy itself was made of waterproof fabrics such as nylon or oilcloth, often brightly colored or patterned. Straps or adjustable cords kept the umbrella anchored to the head, though it required careful adjustment. Too tight, and the wearer risked a mild headache. Too loose, and a sudden gust of wind could launch the wearer into the nearest puddle or unsuspecting bystander. Early users quickly learned that balance and posture were as important as rainfall protection. The umbrella hat also thrived in fairs, sports events, and leisure contexts, where the combination of practicality and novelty created a small but devoted following. Spectators at baseball games, outdoor fairs, or fishing tournaments discovered that a hands-free canopy not only kept them dry but also made them instantly recognizable in a crowd. Want to spot your friend in a sea of umbrellas? Just look for the one perched jauntily on someone's head. It was functional, yes, but it also came with a bonus: comedic visibility. Advertising in the 20th century leaned into this comedic appeal. Catalogues often showed exaggerated illustrations of people wearing umbrella hats while juggling picnic baskets, fishing rods, and hot dogs. The implicit message: this product frees your hands, protects you from rain, and guarantees public attention, whether you like it or not. Some ads even touted it as a fashion accessory, though fashion critics quietly filed complaints. One can imagine a group of early 20th century socialites shaking their heads at these head umbrellas while secretly wishing they had the nerve to try them at a garden party. Despite the comedic effect, the umbrella hat's invention represented genuine ingenuity. It combined centuries of knowledge about waterproof fabrics, collapsible structures, and hands-free utility into a single wearable device. Where traditional umbrellas required two hands and a constant awareness of balance, the umbrella hat promised freedom. One could fish, eat, walk a dog, or wave at neighbors while remaining perfectly dry. Of course, freedom came with a 90% chance of looking ridiculous, but inventors embraced this risk. After all, some progress is only measurable in both functionality and comedy. The umbrella hat also foreshadowed later innovations in personal portable shelters. It inspired ideas about head-mounted protection for sun, rain, or even minor debris concepts, later echoed in industrial helmets, festival gear, and extreme outdoor recreation equipment. The modern novelty item owes its lineage to a combination of necessity, creativity, and a willingness to embrace absurdity. By the end of this era, the umbrella hat had become a fixture of recreational and novelty culture. It wasn't a fashion statement, a military innovation, or a global phenomenon, but it was practical, hands-free, and undeniably amusing. Its design principles, lightweight materials, stability, and waterproof coverage remain unchanged, proving that sometimes the simplest ideas, no matter how ridiculous, stand the test of time. The good news? You could finally walk in the rain without juggling an umbrella or spilling your snacks. The bad news? You looked like a hybrid between a traveling tent and a comedic carnival attraction. And yet somehow, that's part of the charm that keeps umbrella hats alive in novelty shops and online stores even today. The umbrella hat promised freedom, no hands, no fuss, and a 90% chance you'd still look ridiculous. Once the umbrella hat was invented, it didn't take long for the novelty to leap off the shelves and into popular culture, where its hands-free absurdity found a ready audience. What began as a quirky, practical invention quickly became a comedic staple in comics, movies, and novelty advertisements, cementing its reputation as the wearable contraption everyone laughed at and secretly envied. One of the earliest documented pop culture appearances came in mid-20th century comic strips, where inventors, eccentrics, or hapless characters were shown sporting umbrella hats in improbable scenarios. A fisherman struggling to hold a rod, a scientist conducting a storm experiment, or a suburban dad attempting a backyard barbecue, all were depicted with miniature umbrellas strapped to their heads. Cartoonists loved the visual humor. A small canopy could transform an ordinary scene into an absurd tableau, perfectly illustrating the collision of ingenuity and ridiculousness. Comics treated the umbrella hat as a symbol of human resourcefulness, yes, but mostly as proof that humans are willing to look funny in the name of convenience. Movies soon followed suit. In comedy films from the 1950s and 1960s, the umbrella hat appeared as a visual gag, sometimes as a prop, sometimes as a costume piece. Scenes of characters walking in torrential rain while their hat-covered heads bobbed beneath tiny canopies delighted audiences. The umbrella hat became shorthand for quirky inventors, eccentric characters, or hapless outdoors enthusiasts. It was a device that could communicate personality instantly. If a character wore one, the audience knew they were practical, slightly ridiculous, and possibly very clever, or perhaps just hopelessly uncoordinated. Meanwhile, novelty advertisements in magazines, fairs, and early television began promoting the umbrella hat as a fun, hands-free accessory for outdoor leisure. Marketers pitched it to fishermen, campers, and fairgoers with slogans emphasizing convenience, protection, and humor. These ads often exaggerated the benefits, keeping the wearer dry while leaving both hands free for eating, waving, or juggling, and paired them with exaggerated illustrations of people looking both triumphant and absurd. The umbrella hat wasn't just a tool, it was a performance, a visual joke that anyone could participate in while simultaneously enjoying genuine utility. Fishermen became unofficial ambassadors of the umbrella hat. The practicality of keeping hands free for rods, bait, and tackle boxes made them ideal early adopters. Backyard barbecuers, festival goers, and outdoor enthusiasts soon followed. Photographs from the mid to late 20th century show smiling families, competitive anglers, and lone picnickers wearing umbrella hats, proudly displaying their hands-free rain protection. Each image captures the delicate balance between practicality and comedic flair. You're dry, your hands are free, and everyone within a 50-foot radius is silently judging your fashion choices. The umbrella hat's cultural legacy didn't stop at physical media. With the rise of internet culture, the umbrella hat found a second life online. Memes, GIFs, and viral videos immortalized it as the Swiss Army knife of comedy. Protective, functional, and immediately suspicious, social media users embraced it as a symbol of nostalgic absurdity and ironic fashion. You'll find posts jokingly suggesting it as the ultimate pandemic accessory, festival gear, or zombie apocalypse survival tool. Its visual appeal is simple: a human head topped with a tiny canopy. It's instantly recognizable, instantly funny, and perfectly meme-worthy. Nostalgia also plays a huge role. People who grew up seeing umbrella hats in fairs, comic strips, or family photographs remember them fondly and laugh even harder seeing them in modern contexts. Collectors and enthusiasts now seek vintage umbrella hats from the mid-20th century, celebrating them as artifacts of whimsical ingenuity. Some display them alongside other kitschy inventions, appreciating both their practical design and the timeless humor inherent in strapping a tiny collapsible canopy to one's head. Interestingly, the umbrella hat also became a cultural shorthand in storytelling. Filmmakers, cartoonists, and comedians used it to signal a character's quirky inventiveness or eccentricity. Unlike ordinary umbrellas, which can fade into the background, umbrella hats demand attention. They communicate character traits without dialogue, ingenuity, oddity, and a willingness to embrace ridicule in pursuit of comfort. It's a storytelling tool as much as a hands-free rain shield. By now, the umbrella hat has achieved a unique kind of fame. It is simultaneously practical, comedic, and culturally resonant. It thrives in photographs, memes, festivals, and hobbyist collections. Its appearances in pop culture, from comic strips to viral videos, underscore its enduring appeal. The umbrella hat reminds us that sometimes the funniest inventions are also the most clever, and that human creativity is at its most delightful when practicality meets absurdity. The good news? You can keep your hands free and stay dry at the same time. The bad news? You will look ridiculous, and that's part of the charm. The umbrella hat was the Swiss Army knife of comedy. Protective, functional, and immediately suspicious. Once the umbrella hat had firmly established its place in novelty culture, inventors and manufacturers began tinkering with technical improvements. The basic concept, an umbrella perched atop one's head, was ingenious. But like any practical gadget, there was always room for refinement. Over time, the umbrella hat evolved in materials, design, and variety, producing a slew of variants that catered to both functional needs and aesthetic whims. One of the earliest technical improvements was the collapsible frame. Early 20th century models often featured rigid metal spokes that made the umbrella hat sturdy but heavy. Users quickly realized that while they stayed dry, they also risked neck strain, accidental pokes, or minor collisions with low-hanging branches. Enter collapsible and spring-loaded spokes. These allowed the canopy to fold flat for storage, then pop open at the push of a button or gentle tug. Suddenly, the umbrella hat was no longer a cumbersome one-purpose device. It was portable, convenient, and at least in theory, less likely to knock over a passing pedestrian. Waterproof coatings also improved. Early umbrella fabrics were functional but sometimes absorbed water like a sponge, defeating the purpose of wearing the thing at all. Advances in materials science led to oilcloth, nylon, and synthetic waterproof fabrics, allowing rain to bead off and run harmlessly to the ground. Manufacturers also experimented with sun-resistant fabrics for hot weather variants, turning umbrella hats into portable parasols. Whether shielding from rain or the relentless summer sun, users now had a reliable canopy overhead. The combination of foldable frames and modern fabrics represented the first major step toward truly practical wearable umbrellas. Designs became more playful. Novelty patterns, bright colors and bold stripes entered the market, giving the umbrella hat a festival-ready aesthetic. Some featured cartoon characters, neon accents, or metallic finishes. The umbrella hat was no longer just a tool, it was a statement. Imagine a backyard barbecue where multiple heads sport red and yellow striped canopies, resembling a tiny human circus tent. Some critics argued that certain colors, especially neon green or hot pink, might have doubled as traffic control devices for unsuspecting neighbors, and yet that's exactly what made them endearing. Variants proliferated. Beyond the classic single canopy, designers experimented with sun-only hats, double umbrella rigs, and foldable festival versions. Sun-only hats were lighter, often made from breathable fabrics, and ideal for gardeners, picnickers, or beachgoers. Double umbrella rigs offered expanded coverage, perfect for sharing with a small dog or holding multiple drinks while walking in the rain. Foldable festival versions emphasized portability, aesthetics, and humor, lightweight, colorful, and designed to draw attention while providing hands-free protection. Each variant reflected a balance between functionality and spectacle, often tilting heavily toward the latter. User demographics also shaped technical evolution. Fishermen remained loyal, valuing hands-free canopy coverage while casting rods or handling bait. Gardeners appreciated the ability to tend plants without juggling umbrellas and tools. Festival goers adopted bright patterned hats as both practical and comedic accessories, perfect for standing out in a crowd. In each case, users demanded lightweight comfort, durability, and stability, forcing designers to rethink everything from strap placement to canopy angle. Early experiments with elasticized headbands, adjustable buckles, and lightweight rods demonstrated the adaptability of the basic concept. Wind resistance became a minor obsession. Umbrella hats, while protective, could become miniature sails in gusty conditions. Designers experimented with vented canopies and flexible spokes to reduce flapping and improve stability. Some innovative, but admittedly strange designs included shock-absorbing rods and weighted rims to keep the hat in place. Users learned that a poorly engineered umbrella hat could transform from protective gear into a wind-powered comedy device in a matter of seconds, sending the wearer spinning or colliding gently with nearby fences, pets, or picnic tables. Finally, comfort became a design priority. Adjustable straps, padded crowns, and lightweight frameworks ensured that wearing the umbrella hat for extended periods, whether fishing, gardening, or attending an outdoor festival, did not result in headaches, neck pain, or mild humiliation. By the late 20th century, these design tweaks allowed the umbrella hat to exist as a fully realized, usable accessory rather than a mere novelty. It retained its comedic appeal while maximizing practical utility, hands-free rain protection, visibility in a crowd, and a gentle reminder that human ingenuity often borders on absurdity. Some users embraced these innovations with particular flair. Neon colors, bold stripes, and exaggerated designs turned heads and provided endless photo opportunities. One could almost imagine a group of festival goers forming a human rainbow of canopies, a moving tribute to both technical progress and human humor. The umbrella hat had evolved from a single-purpose novelty into a multifunctional, visually striking accessory, blending practicality, design innovation, and comedy into one small package. The good news? Modern umbrella hats are comfortable, functional, and surprisingly versatile. The bad news? Some people upgraded to neon colors and stripes, turning their heads into a walking traffic cone of rain defense. But really, that's part of the charm. Some people upgraded to neon colors and stripes, turning their heads into a walking traffic cone of rain defense. The umbrella hat, after nearly a century of whimsical experimentation and technical evolution, has earned a unique place in the cultural imagination. It persists today, not as a mainstream fashion accessory, but as a charming novelty, a statement of quirky innovation, and a reminder that sometimes human ingenuity is just as much about humor as it is about utility. Its continued presence in novelty stores, online marketplaces, and backyard festivals speaks volumes about our collective obsession with convenience, absurdity, and hands-free protection. Why does the umbrella hat endure? One reason is simple. It solves a basic human problem in an unorthodox way. Rain and sun remain constant companions in daily life, and the umbrella hat offers hands-free protection, which is genuinely convenient. You can fish, garden, picnic, or grill without juggling a collapsible canopy, yet it remains compact, inexpensive, and easy to deploy. This practical benefit, though modest, ensures that the umbrella hat is not purely comedic. Even if you look ridiculous, your hands and your snacks remain dry. Its endurance is also fueled by the umbrella hat's status as a cultural icon of eccentricity. Over decades, it has appeared in comic strips, novelty ads, movies, and festival photography, always representing human ingenuity pushed to the edge of absurdity. The hat signals a willingness to prioritize practicality over social approval, a subtle form of rebellion disguised as whimsy. Wearing one is a silent declaration: I value dryness and hands-free living, and I am prepared for judgment, laughter, and perhaps a photo op. In modern times, the umbrella hat thrives in internet culture, which has a particular fondness for ironic and nostalgic humor. Memes celebrating hands-free rain protection frequently surface on social media, pairing photos of grinning wearers with captions about multitasking, eccentricity, or improbable life hacks. A single image of a brightly colored umbrella hat can elicit laughs, likes, and shares in seconds. Its appeal is universal. Children, festival goers, anglers, and meme lovers alike recognize the juxtaposition of function and absurdity. Humor is baked into its very design, from the metal spokes to the tiny canopy that turns any head into a walking spectacle. Novelty stores and online shops have capitalized on this enduring appeal. Modern versions come in neon colors, cartoon prints, and oversized canopies, often paired with adjustable straps and lightweight materials. Some sellers market them as gifts, festival gear, or promotional items, while others embrace the absurd outright. Reviews frequently praise their practicality, while simultaneously noting the inevitable amusement they generate. Friends will laugh, strangers will stare, and photos will inevitably appear online. In short, the umbrella hat continues to thrive because it is simultaneously useful, comedic, and shareable. The umbrella hat also occupies a special niche in the world of ironic fashion statements. While no one expects it to become a runway staple, it is a potent symbol for those who embrace kitsch, nostalgia, and whimsy. It challenges traditional aesthetics, reminding us that sometimes comfort and creativity take precedence over elegance. People wear them at festivals, barbecues, and outdoor events, often pairing them with exaggerated enthusiasm or complementary quirky attire. The hat becomes more than a rain shield. It becomes a badge of individuality and humor, a miniature canopy of rebellion against mundane fashion norms. Its legacy is also educational. For those exploring human creativity, the umbrella hat illustrates centuries of problem-solving, iteration, and cultural adaptation, from early head-mounted prototypes to commercially produced novelty items. The umbrella hat demonstrates the human desire to blend function with fun. It embodies the principle that innovation does not always have to be serious. Practical solutions can coexist with absurdity, and in fact, the combination often enhances their appeal. In an era dominated by smartphones, smartwatches, and wearable tech, the umbrella hat retains a retro charm. It is low-tech, mechanically simple, and instantly understandable. There is no app, no battery, and no connectivity required. Just a collapsible canopy, a few metal spokes, and an elastic strap. And yet in its simplicity lies brilliance. It protects hands, keeps heads dry, and provokes laughter. In a world of over-engineered gadgets, the umbrella hat reminds us that sometimes basic, whimsical solutions endure longer than complex high-tech inventions. Ultimately, the umbrella hat survives because it appeals to both utility and humor, two forces that have always guided human invention. It didn't revolutionize fashion or redefine outdoor equipment. It didn't save humanity from torrential downpours, but it offered a hands-free solution, an instantly recognizable visual joke, and a little bit of dignity in otherwise soggy circumstances. Its legacy is not in mass adoption, but in its enduring presence as a symbol of creativity, practicality, and unabashed comedy. The good news: you can still wear an umbrella hat today and keep your hands free while enjoying a picnic, fishing, or a festival. The bad news: fashion critics will still scoff, friends will still laugh, and yes, you will still look absurd, but sometimes that's exactly the point. The umbrella hat didn't save fashion, but it saved hands, and sometimes dignity barely.